Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back to a moment that changed everything. A night in the year 410 AD when the most powerful empire on earth simply walked away. Imagine waking up tomorrow and every government office is empty, every soldier has vanished, every public service has stopped. The highways crack, the power grid fails, and suddenly you're on your own. That's what happened to Roman Britain. 400 years of civilization gone in a heartbeat. And in the chaos that followed, from the smoke and ruins of a collapsing world, a legend would be born. A legend we're still chasing today. The legend of King Arthur. Now, before we step into the darkness of Britain's past together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if the story truly speaks to you. And hey, I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I genuinely love connecting with you all. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's walk together into the last days of Roman Britain. You know, we often think of Rome's fall as this dramatic, cinematic moment. Barbarians at the gates, cities burning, emperors fleeing. But the truth? The truth is somehow even more unsettling, because Britain didn't fall to an invasion. It was abandoned. Let me paint you a picture. It's the year 410. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain has been part of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. If you're living in Londinium, that's London, your city has proper streets, not muddy paths. Stone buildings line those streets, some of them 3 stories tall. There's running water, public baths where you can soak in heated pools, libraries, theatres, markets filled with goods from Africa, Spain, Greece and beyond, wine from Italy, olive oil from North Africa, pottery from modern-day Turkey. You can read and write in Latin. You pay your taxes in Roman coins. Your children are learning grammar and rhetoric. Justice is dispensed in proper courtrooms. And most importantly, there's order, there's law, there's protection, because beyond your city walls along the northern frontier there are legions, professional soldiers, the finest military force ever assembled. They guard Hadrian's Wall, that massive stone barrier snaking across the entire width of northern Britain. They keep the Picts and the Scots at bay. They maintain the peace. They are the reason you sleep soundly at night. And then, one day, they leave. Now here's what makes this so devastating. It's not even about Britain. See, back in Rome, the empire is crumbling. Germanic tribes are pouring across the Rhine. The Visigoths are literally at Rome's gates. The emperor is desperate. And so he makes a choice, a calculated, cold political choice. He pulls the legions out of Britain. Every soldier, every administrator, every government official, they march to the ports, board ships, and sail away. And Britain is told, essentially, you're on your own. Good luck. Imagine that. Imagine being a Roman citizen in Britain, watching the last legion march down your street, the sound of boots on stone. The eagle standards gleaming in the sun one last time. Your neighbours are gathered, silent, watching them go. And you know, everyone knows, that they're never coming back. The historian Gildas, writing about a century and a half later, calls this period the groans of the Britons. That phrase haunts me. The groans of the Britons. Not screams, not shouts. Groans. The sound of a people slowly realizing they've been cut adrift. Because here's what happens next, and this is where it gets really fascinating and really dark. Within a generation, maybe 2, that sophisticated Roman British civilization starts to simply disintegrate. The heated baths go cold because no one knows how to maintain the hypocauste systems. The aqueducts crack and break. Roads, no longer maintained, become rutted and dangerous. The pottery workshops close because trade networks have collapsed. Literacy, something that had been common for 400 years, begins to vanish. By 450 AD, maybe only a handful of monks and nobles can still read Latin. Cities, those magnificent Roman cities, start to empty out. People move back to the countryside because who wants to live in a crumbling stone shell when you can't maintain it? Archaeological evidence shows us something almost eerie. In many Roman villas and townhouses, the final occupants actually started farming inside the buildings. They'd keep animals in what used to be elegant dining rooms. They'd build cooking fires on beautiful mosaic floors, not because they were stupid or uncivilized, but because the system that supported that lifestyle was gone. And here's a detail that really gets to me. Roman coins. For 400 years, Britain used standardized Roman currency. Silver denarii, gold aurae, bronze sestertii. But after 410, no new coins arrive from the continent. The mints are closed. And so the Britons start doing something they hadn't done in centuries. They go back to barter, trading goods for goods, like stepping backward in time. But perhaps nothing symbolizes the collapse more than the loss of the written word. We have thousands of documents from Roman Britain, tax records, letters, legal documents, gravestones. The Romans were obsessive record keepers. But after 410, for the next 200 years, we have almost nothing. It's like someone turned off the lights and locked the door. Historians call it the Dark Ages, not because people were ignorant, but because we are. We're in the dark about what happened because they stopped writing it down. Now, I want you to really sit with this for a moment, because this is where the emotional weight hits. If you were alive in Britain in, say, 430 AD, just 20 years after the Romans left, you would have been surrounded by the ghosts of a world you could no longer understand. You'd walk past magnificent buildings you couldn't maintain. You'd see Latin inscriptions you couldn't read. Your grandfather would tell you stories about heated baths and libraries and travelling safely on stone roads to distant cities, and it would sound like fantasy, like myth. And that's the tragedy of it, isn't it? These people didn't lose their civilization to an earthquake or a plague. They lost it to abandonment, to neglect, to the simple fact that once the organizational structure collapsed, nobody quite knew how to keep the machine running. It's like if you woke up tomorrow and every engineer, every electrician, every technician had vanished overnight. How long would it take before you couldn't turn on the lights? Before the internet went dark? Before modern life became a memory? But here's where it gets even more complicated, and this is something that often gets overlooked. Not everyone in Britain was sad to see Rome go. The Roman occupation, let's be honest, had been exactly that, an occupation. For 400 years, Britain had been a province, a resource to be exploited. They mined lead, silver, and gold to send back to Rome. They grew grain to feed Roman armies. They paid taxes to foreign emperors, and the native British culture, the Celtic traditions, the Druidic practices, had been suppressed, sometimes violently. So when the legions left, some Britons probably thought, finally, freedom. They probably imagined they could return to the old ways, rebuild their own kingdoms, govern themselves. And for a little while, maybe that worked. Local strongmen, petty kings, tribal leaders, they started carving up Britain into smaller territories, little kingdoms with big ambitions. But freedom, as it turned out, came with a price. Because the Romans hadn't just provided civilization, they'd provided protection. And there were people watching Britain, people who'd been kept at bay by the legions, the Picts and Scots to the north, the Irish raiders from the west, and most dangerous of all, the Saxons from across the North Sea. The Saxons. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about them in the coming parts of this story, but for now, just know this. They'd been raiding Britain's coast for decades, even while Rome was still in charge. The Romans had built a whole network of coastal forts called the Saxon Shore just to defend against them. But now the forts were empty. The watchtowers were abandoned, and the Saxons noticed. By the mid-5th century, Britain wasn't just in economic collapse. It was in existential danger. Different regions were falling into civil war, fighting each other instead of banding together. The Irish were attacking from the west. The Picts were raiding from the north, and the Saxons were coming from the east. And this desperate, chaotic, violent period, this is when Arthur's story begins. Not the Arthur of Camelot and Gleaming Knights, not the Arthur of Hollywood and fantasy novels, but a different Arthur, a real Arthur maybe, a British war leader who, against impossible odds, tried to hold back the tide, tried to preserve what was left of Roman-British civilization, tried to keep the lights on just a little bit longer. Gildas, that same historian I mentioned earlier, he writes about this period with such anguish. He talks about how the Britons sent desperate letters to Rome begging for help. The barbarians drive us to the sea drives us back to the barbarians. Between these two methods of death, we're either slaughtered or drowned. Can you imagine writing those words, knowing there's no help coming? But here's the thing about human beings. We're stubborn. We don't go quietly. When the lights go out, we light candles. When the walls crumble, we build new ones. When civilization collapses, we try to remember what it was and rebuild it. And that's exactly what happened in the darkest hours of 5th century Britain. Someone rose to fight. Maybe his name was Arthur. Maybe it wasn't. But some group of leaders, decided they would not surrender. They had not let Britain fall into complete darkness. And the battle they fought, the victory they achieved, would echo through the centuries, would become legend, would inspire poets and kings and dreamers for the next 1,500 years. The Roman world was ending, but a new world, a world of mystery, courage, and legend, was just beginning. So here's my question for you, as we close this first chapter of our journey. What do you hold on to when everything falls apart? What do you fight for when all seems lost? The people of 5th century Britain faced that question every single day. And the answer they gave, in blood and courage and sheer determination, would forge the greatest legend the British Isles have ever known. But the question remains, was there ever really an Arthur? Or is he just the name we gave to hope itself? Next, we're going to dive into the mystery itself. Why do we know so little about this period? Why are these centuries called dark? And more importantly, what happened to all the stories, all the records, all the truth about what really happened? Because something very strange occurred after Rome fell. Britain didn't just lose its infrastructure, it lost its memory. Stay with me. This is where the real mystery begins. So let's talk about silence. Not the peaceful kind, the haunting kind, the kind that makes historians lose sleep at night. Because here's something that will blow your mind. We have more written records from Roman Britain in a single decade, let's say 380 to 390 AD, than we have from the entire next 200 years combined. 2 centuries. And what do we have to show for it? A handful of documents, a few cryptic passages, some names carved in stone. That's it. It's as if someone hit the mute button on an entire civilization. And the question that's haunted scholars for generations is simple. Why? Why did Britain go silent? And more importantly, what really happened during those phantom centuries? You know what's funny? We call this period the Dark Ages, and people always assume that means the people living then were ignorant, primitive, backwards. But that's not it at all. They weren't in the dark. We are. We're the ones stumbling around in the darkness trying to piece together what happened, squinting at fragments and shadows. They knew exactly what was going on. They lived it. They just didn't write it down. Or if they did, those writings didn't survive. And that brings us to the most frustrating man in British history, Gildas. Gildas was a British monk, or maybe a priest, we're not even totally sure about that, who wrote sometime around 540 AD. So we're talking about 130 years after the Romans left. He's the closest thing we have to an eyewitness account of this period, and he wrote a book called De Excedio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain. Catchy title, right? Now you'd think this would be a goldmine of information. Finally, someone who was actually there, or at least close enough to talk to people who remembered. But here's the thing about Gildas. He wasn't trying to write history. He was writing a sermon, a religious rant. He was furious, absolutely livid at the British kings of his time, and his entire book is basically him screaming, "You sinners! God is punishing Britain because you're all terrible." So he'll mention things, really important things, almost as an afterthought. He'll say, "Oh yeah, and then there was this big battle at Mount Badon where we totally defeated the Saxons," but he won't tell you when it happened, where it happened, or who led the British forces. He just drops it in there like it's common knowledge and moves on to yelling about sin again. It's like if the only surviving document about World War II was written by an angry preacher who mentioned D-Day in passing, but spent 30 pages condemning people for wearing mixed fabrics. Historians literally want to reach back through time and shake Gildas by the shoulders. Give us details, man. And Arthur, the legendary king we're supposedly talking about. Gildas doesn't mention him, not once, not by name, which is, well, it's either really significant or it means nothing at all, and scholars have been arguing about which for the past 400 years. Some say, see, if Arthur was really this great king, this legendary figure who saved Britain, why doesn't Gildas mention him? And that's a fair point. But others argue, maybe Gildas didn't mention him because everyone already knew about him. Maybe Arthur was so famous that Gildas felt no need to name him explicitly. Or, and this is darker, maybe Gildas had personal reasons to omit Arthur. Medieval legends claim that Arthur killed Gildas's brother, so maybe Gildas simply refused to honour him in writing. We'll never know. But here's what we do know from Gildas. Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries was a mess, a violent, chaotic, desperate mess. He describes Saxons raiding, Britons fighting back, cities burning, people fleeing. He talks about a British leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus, we'll come back to him later, who organised some kind of resistance, and he mentions that big battle at Badon, which apparently stopped the Saxon advance for a generation. But beyond that, vague, frustratingly vague. Now fast forward about 200 years to the next big source we have, the Venerable Bede. Bede was an English monk writing around 731 AD, and he wrote The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Bede is an absolute legend among historians because he actually tried to be accurate. He cited his sources. He organised things chronologically. He's like the first real historian of medieval Britain, and his work is incredibly valuable. But, and this is a big but, Bede was English. Anglo-Saxon English, the descendants of the invaders, so his sympathies were, let's say, different from Gildas's. Bede's writing from the perspective of the winners, and guess what? Bede also doesn't mention Arthur, not once. Bede talks about the Saxon arrival, he talks about their conflicts with the Britons, he even mentions the Battle of Badon, that same crucial battle Gildas wrote about, but he attributes the British victory to Ambrosius Aurelianus, not to any Arthur. So either Bede didn't know about Arthur, or he didn't think Arthur was worth mentioning, or Arthur had become a purely British legend that the English chose to ignore. Are you starting to see the problem here? We've got huge gaps, missing pieces, and the pieces we do have don't quite fit together. Let me put this in perspective for you. Imagine it's the year 3000, and future historians are trying to understand what happened in America during the 21st century. But they only have 2 documents. One angry blog post from 2040 that mentions a war but doesn't say where or when, and one textbook from 2230 written by people who weren't even living in America. How accurate do you think their understanding would be? How many legends and myths might they confuse with reality? That's essentially what we're dealing with when we try to understand Dark Ages Britain. So historians have had to get creative. They've turned to other sources the original writers probably never imagined would be important. Welsh poetry, for instance. There are fragments of poems written in Old Welsh that seem to reference Arthur. The earliest is called Y Gododin, composed maybe around 600 AD, possibly earlier. And there's one line, just one, that says something like, "He was brave, but he was no Arthur." That's it. That's the line. One casual reference suggesting that Arthur was the gold standard of warriors. Someone so legendary that you could compare other heroes to him, and everyone would know what you meant. It's like saying today, he was strong, but he was no Superman. We know what that means. Superman is the measuring stick. But does that prove Superman is real? Of course not. Then we've got the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons, written around 828 AD, almost certainly compiled by a Welsh monk named Nennius, though even that's debated. This document is the first one to actually name Arthur and list his battles. It says Arthur fought 12 battles against the Saxons, the last one being Badon, where Arthur supposedly killed 960 men single-handedly. Now, 960 men, by himself, in one battle, even accounting for medieval exaggeration, that's a lot. That number tells us something important. By 828 AD, just 400 years after Arthur supposedly lived, his story had already crossed from history into legend. The man, if he existed, had become a myth. But here's what keeps the mystery alive. Here's why historians can't just dismiss Arthur entirely. Because something happened. Something real. Something significant enough that echoes of it survived for centuries despite the lack of written records. The Battle of Badon was real. Almost all scholars agree on that. The Saxon advance into Western Britain really did halt for about 50 years in the late 5th or early 6th century. Something, or someone, stopped them. Archaeological evidence backs this up. When you dig in eastern Britain, you find Saxon settlements spreading steadily westward through the 5th century. And then, around 500 AD, that expansion just stops for decades. The archaeological record shows a clear pause. The Saxons didn't push further west during that time. They consolidated what they had, but they didn't conquer more territory, so something held them back. Some victory, some leader, some military success gave the Britons breathing room. Was it Arthur? Was it Ambrosius? Was it a coalition of British leaders whose names have been lost? We can't say for certain, but we can say this. The legend had to start somewhere. Legends don't just appear out of thin air. There's usually a kernel of truth, however small, at their centre. You know what I find most haunting about this period? It's not just that we lost the records, it's that we lost the memory. Think about it. Within 3 or 4 generations after Rome left, Britain had largely forgotten how to maintain Roman buildings. Within 6 or 7 generations, they'd forgotten how to write. And within 10 generations, They'd forgotten their own history. The past became legend. Legend became myth. And as for the myth, well, the myth took on a life of its own. There's something profound in that, don't you think? About how quickly civilization can forget itself. About how fast the extraordinary becomes ordinary and then becomes impossible and then becomes fairy tale. The grandchildren of people who bathed in heated pools and read books in libraries grew up thinking those things were myths. Stories the old folks told that couldn't possibly be true. And Arthur got caught in that transformation. Maybe he was real, a tough, skilled military commander who won some crucial victories. But without written records, without historians documenting his deeds, he became malleable. He became whatever people needed him to be. A hero who grew larger with each retelling. A symbol of British resistance. A promise that better days existed once and might exist again. This is what happens in the dark. In the absence of fact, imagination fills the void. And sometimes, just sometimes, imagination creates something more powerful than fact ever could. But we're not done digging yet. Because while Britain was silent, the ground beneath it was not. Buried in the earth, waiting for archaeologists with trowels and brushes and carbon dating equipment was evidence. Real, physical, tangible evidence. And in recent decades we've started finding it. Pieces of the puzzle that written records never captured, and what we've found has been absolutely stunning. Because it turns out the story we thought we knew about barbarian invasions and the collapse of civilization isn't quite right. The truth is stranger, more complex and in some ways more fascinating than the legends ever were. But to understand what really happened, we need to talk about the Saxons themselves. Who were they? Where did they really come from? And here's the question that's going to surprise you. Were they actually invaders at all? Because what if I told you that the Saxons didn't conquer Britain through warfare? What if I told you they were invited? Hold that thought. We're about to uncover one of the most controversial theories in British history. A theory that, if true, makes the entire Arthur legend even more complicated and more tragic than anyone imagined. Picture this. You're a British king in the year 440 AD. Your name is Vortigern. At least that's what later chronicles call you. Though Vortigern might not even be a name. It might be a title meaning High King or Overlord. But anyway, you're Vortigern, and you've got problems. Big problems. The Romans have been gone for 30 years. Your kingdom, if you can even call it that, is falling apart. The Picts are raiding from the north, stealing cattle, burning villages, killing your people. The Irish are hitting your western coasts in their boats, fast and brutal. Your own rival British kings are fighting you for territory instead of helping. Your army is a joke compared to what the legions used to be. You're desperate. You're losing. And then you have an idea. An idea that will seem brilliant right up until the moment it destroys everything. You've heard about these warriors across the North Sea, Germanic tribesmen, Angles, Saxons, Jutes. They're fierce fighters, legendary sailors, and, this is the important part, they're available for hire. Mercenaries. They don't care about your politics or your rival kings. They just want land, food, and payment. And you've got land. Lots of empty land, actually, after all the chaos and depopulation. So you make them an offer. Come to Britain. Settle in the east, on the coast. Build your homes, farm the land, and in exchange, protect us. Fight the Picts. Fight the Irish. Keep the borders safe. It's a deal the Romans made with barbarian tribes for centuries, the federati system. Controlled settlement in exchange for military service. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler alert, everything could go wrong, and everything did. Now, before we get to the catastrophe, let me ask you something. Have you ever invited someone to stay at your house thinking it would just be a few days and then weeks later they're still there, eating your food, rearranging your furniture, and basically acting like they own the place? No, just me? Well, multiply that feeling by about 10,000. Add swords and battle axes and you'll understand what happened to Britain. According to later chronicles, particularly Gildas and Bede, Vortigern invited 3 shiploads of Saxon warriors led by 2 brothers, Hengist and Horsa. Those names, by the way, literally mean stallion and horse in Old English, which has led some historians to think they might be mythical figures, possibly even ancient horse gods who got historicized. But let's assume they were real for the moment. Hengist and Horsa arrive. They fight brilliantly. They defeat the Picts. Vortigern is thrilled. So thrilled, in fact, that he gives them more land. And then, according to legend, Hengist does something very clever. He throws a feast. He invites Vortigern. And at this feast, Vortigern meets Hengist's daughter, Rowena. The chronicles describe her as breathtakingly beautiful. Vortigern falls madly in love. He's so smitten that he agrees to give Hengist the entire kingdom of Kent, a huge chunk of southeastern Britain, in exchange for Rowena's hand in marriage. And that's when Hengist sends word back home. Hey guys, you're not going to believe this, but we just got given an entire kingdom. Might want to come over here. And they did. By the hundreds, then by the thousands. Ship after ship arriving on British shores filled with Saxon families, men, women, children. They weren't coming to raid anymore. They were coming to stay. Bede, writing about 300 years later, describes what happened next with a phrase that still sends chills down historians' spines. He says the Saxons, once established, turned their weapons against the island itself. The mercenaries became the invaders. The hired protectors became the conquerors. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is where modern archaeology has completely rewritten our understanding of this period. Because the traditional story is one of violent invasion. Saxon hordes pouring across the sea, slaughtering Britons, burning cities, conquering the land by force, fire and blood and conquest. Except that's not quite what the evidence shows, and this is fascinating. When archaeologists excavate Saxon cemeteries in eastern England, and they've found hundreds of them, they find something unexpected. These graves, dating from the mid-5th to 6th centuries, contain relatively few weapons. I mean, yes, there are warrior burials with swords and shields and spears, but they're the minority. Most graves contain farming tools, brooches, pottery, spindle whorls for weaving, family stuff, peaceful stuff. And here's another detail that blows my mind. When forensic experts analyze the skeletal remains, looking for signs of violent death, they find very few. Sword cuts on bones, rare. Arrow wounds, uncommon. These weren't populations locked in constant warfare. These were people living relatively peaceful lives. But wait, it gets stranger. DNA analysis and isotope studies, looking at the chemical composition of teeth and bones to figure out where people grew up, reveal something remarkable. In many Saxon settlements, the population was mixed. Some individuals were definitely born in northern Germany or Denmark, their isotope signatures matching those regions, but others, born right there in Britain. Some were fully Saxon genetically, others fully British, and quite a few were, both, mixed ancestry. In other words, the Saxons and Britons were intermarrying, living side by side, not everywhere, and not all at once, but more than you'd expect if this was a simple story of violent conquest. Dr. Catherine Hills at Cambridge University has spent decades studying Anglo-Saxon archaeology, and she puts it beautifully. She says the Saxon takeover of Britain was less like the Norman conquest, a single military invasion, and more like a folk movement. families migrating, settling, gradually over decades shifting the cultural and linguistic landscape. So if it wasn't violent conquest, how did the Saxons end up controlling most of eastern and central Britain within 100 years? How did Latin-speaking Christian Romano-Britons become Germanic-speaking pagans? The answer is both simple and devastating: numbers and culture. The Saxon settlers, once they started arriving, just kept coming, and they brought with them a vigorous, cohesive culture. They had strong family structures, effective farming techniques suited to northern climates, and a warrior ethos that valued honor and loyalty. Meanwhile, the Britons were fragmented, fighting among themselves, trying desperately to maintain Roman systems that no longer had institutional support. It's like if you slowly replace the population of a city, neighborhood by neighborhood, generation by generation. Eventually the language changes, the customs change, the very identity of the place transforms, and that's what happened in much of Britain. But, and this is crucial, it didn't happen everywhere. Western Britain, places like Wales, Cornwall, and parts of what would become Cumbria, remained British. The Saxons never conquered them, which means there was resistance, there was pushback. There were Britons who said, "No further, this is where we make our stand." And this is where our story darkens, because even if the Saxon settlement started peacefully, even if some of it was gradual migration rather than conquest, there was still violence, there were still battles, there were still British villages that woke up one morning to find Saxon warbands at their gates. There were still families slaughtered, lands seized, cultures destroyed. Gildas, writing in the 540s, doesn't mince words. He describes Saxon brutality in vivid, angry detail. He talks about cities burned, churches destroyed, priests killed at altars, people fleeing in terror. He uses phrases like fire spread from sea to sea and describes refugees escaping to the mountains, hiding in forests, starving in caves. Now, is Gildas exaggerating? Probably. He's writing with religious fury, trying to make a point about sin and punishment. But even accounting for hyperbole, something terrible happened. Some conflict brutal enough to scar the British memory for generations. Brutal enough that centuries later the stories still carried the weight of trauma. And here's what really gets me. The tragedy of Vortigern's mistake, if that story's even true, is that he was trying to save his people. He wasn't evil or stupid, he was desperate. He looked around at a collapsing world and made a calculated decision. Hire foreign warriors, give them land, buy some security. It was pragmatic, it was logical. It was exactly what Roman emperors had done for centuries. But Rome had the institutions, the money, the military infrastructure to control their mercenaries. Britain didn't. Britain was too weak, too divided, too far gone. And so the solution became the problem. The cure became the poison. There's a lesson in that, isn't there? About how quickly things can spiral. About how decisions made in desperation, even reasonable decisions, can have consequences that ripple for centuries. About how inviting someone in is easy, but getting them to leave is a whole different story. Think about it from both sides for a moment. You're a Saxon farmer in northern Germany around 450 AD. Life is hard. The land is cold and marshy. There's not enough food. You hear stories about Britain. Green fields, empty land, opportunities. A British king is offering land to settlers. Why wouldn't you go? Why wouldn't you take your family and sail to a better life? You're not invading. You're immigrating. You're not a conqueror. You're a pioneer. You build a farm, raise your children, live your life. And if the locals resent you? Well, you were invited, weren't you? You made a deal. It's not your fault if they regret it now. But if you're British, watching these newcomers arrive year after year, settling on your ancestral lands, speaking a language you don't understand, worshipping gods you don't recognize, gradually becoming the majority. How do you feel? Threatened? Angry? Helpless? Like strangers are taking over your country while you're too weak to stop them? Both perspectives are human. Both are understandable. And that's what makes this period so heartbreaking. It's not a simple story of good versus evil. It's a story of peoples colliding, cultures clashing, and everyone doing what they thought they had to do to survive. But survival, in the end, is about power. And by the middle of the 5th century, the power in Britain was shifting. The Britons, fragmented and leaderless, were losing ground. The Saxons, organized and growing in number, were gaining it. And in that shift, in that dangerous imbalance, war became inevitable. Someone needed to stand up. Someone needed to rally the Britons, unite them, lead them. Someone needed to say, "We are still here. This is still our land, and we will fight for it." That someone, at least according to the fragments of history we have, was not a legendary king with a magic sword. It was a Roman, or rather, a Romano-Briton who remembered what Rome had been and tried desperately to bring that strength back. His name was Ambrosius Aurelianus, and before there could be an Arthur, there had to be an Ambrosius, because Ambrosius didn't just fight the Saxons. He gave the Britons something they'd lost in the chaos: hope, organization, a reason to believe they could win. He lit a fire that would burn for a generation and create the conditions for legend itself. So who was this man? This forgotten hero whose name barely survives in the chronicles? And how did he manage to do what seemed impossible? Turn the tide against the Saxon advance? Let's find out. Because Ambrosius Aurelianus is the key to everything. He's the bridge between history and legend, between Rome and Arthur, between what was and what we wish had been. Here's the thing about heroes. We remember the ones with good stories, knights in shining armor, magic swords, round tables, tragic romances. We remember those. But the real heroes, the ones who actually did the work, who organized the resistance, who held the line when everything was falling apart, those heroes often fade into footnotes. And that brings us to the most important man you've probably never heard of, Ambrosius Aurelianus. If Arthur is Britain's dream, Ambrosius is Britain's reality. And honestly, his story might be even more remarkable than the legend. So who was Ambrosius Aurelianus? Well, buckle up, because what little we know about him is absolutely fascinating. Gildas, remember our angry monk friend, describes him in a way that's pretty unique for the period. He calls Ambrosius a gentleman, which in Latin is vir modestus. He says Ambrosius had Roman parents who had worn the purple, which is code for saying they were of imperial rank, possibly even royalty. Think about what that means. Ambrosius wasn't some rough tribal warlord or upstart chieftain. He was, quite literally, the last of the Romans. Born into a family that remembered empire, that had worn togas, that had attended schools and baths and theatres. His parents might have been Roman administrators or military officers before the collapse. Maybe they even remembered when Britain was still receiving orders from Rome. And then, and this is the tragic part, Gildas tells us that Ambrosius's parents perished in the storm. Most historians interpret the storm as the Saxon conflicts. Somewhere in the chaos of the mid-5th century, Ambrosius's family was killed. Murdered, probably. Maybe their villa was burned. Maybe they were caught in a Saxon raid. We don't know. But what we do know is that Ambrosius survived. Can you imagine that? You're a young man, raised in privilege, educated in Roman classics, probably taught Latin and Greek, trained in rhetoric and law. You represent the last generation of true Roman Britain. And then your world is torn apart. Your family is killed. Your civilization is collapsing around you. Everything you were raised to be, Everything you were prepared for is gone. What do you do? Do you flee to the continent like so many other Romano-Britons did? Do you retreat to a monastery and pray for better days? Do you just give up? Ambrosius did none of those things. Instead, he went to war. Gildas writes that Ambrosius challenged the victors to battle. I love that phrase, challenged the victors. Think about the audacity of that. The Saxons were winning. They were expanding, settling, growing stronger every year. And here comes this one Roman nobleman saying essentially, not so fast. But here's what makes Ambrosius truly remarkable. He wasn't just brave, he was smart. He understood something that the fractured British kingdoms didn't. You can't fight organized enemies with chaos. You can't defeat armies with mobs. If you want to beat the Saxons, you need to think like Rome. You need organization, discipline, strategy, and above all, unity. So Ambrosius did something revolutionary. He started rallying the surviving Romano-British communities, the towns that still had walls, the nobles who still remembered Roman military tactics, the soldiers who had served in the old auxiliary units before the legions left. He pulled them together into something resembling a real army. Now, I want you to picture what this must have looked like. Imagine you're a British farmer in, say, 470 AD. Your village has been raided twice. Your lord can't protect you. The old certainties are gone. And then one day, riders arrive. They're wearing armor, not the rough stuff you see on local warlords, but proper Roman-style equipment, patched and repaired but recognizable. They carry standards, organized banners, and they're led by this man, Ambrosius, who speaks with authority and promises not revenge, but survival, not glory, but order. Would you follow him? I think I would, and clearly many Britons did, because according to Gildas, from the time Ambrosius took charge, sometimes our countrymen won, sometimes the enemy. That's a huge shift. Before Ambrosius, it was all losses, all retreat. After him, the Britons started winning. Not every battle, not every skirmish, but enough. Enough to stop the Saxon expansion, enough to give people hope. But here's the frustrating part, the part that keeps me up at night, honestly. We know almost nothing else about Ambrosius. We don't know where he was based. We don't know which battles he fought. We don't know if he lived 5 more years or 30 more years. He appears in history like a comet, brilliant and brief, and then he's gone. Bede, writing 2 centuries later, barely mentions him. The Historia Britonum from the 9th century includes him, but seems confused about who he was. Some later Welsh genealogies claim he was a king. Others say he was a war leader. Some traditions say he was based in Wales, others in the West Country, still others in the north. The only other reference we have that might be about Ambrosius comes from a place you wouldn't expect. A 6th century Byzantine historian named Procopius. Stay with me here. Procopius, writing in Constantinople, mentions in passing a British king named Reoccupied, who crossed the sea to fight in Gaul around 470 AD. Some scholars think Reoccupied might be Ambrosius. Reoccupied could be a title meaning high king, and the dates roughly match, but it's speculation, educated guessing. So why don't we know more? Why isn't Ambrosius as famous as Arthur? Why aren't there Ambrosius movies and TV shows and fantasy novels? I think there are a few reasons. First, Ambrosius was real. He was a flesh and blood commander dealing with the messy reality of post-Roman Britain. He didn't have magic swords or wizard advisors. He had logistics problems and supply issues and political infighting, and the grinding, unglamorous work of holding together a coalition. That's not the stuff of legends. Second, Ambrosius represented the past. He was trying to rebuild Rome, to restore what had been. But by the time the legends were being written down, in the 9th and 10th centuries, Rome was ancient history. Medieval writers wanted a different kind of hero, a Christian king, a knight, someone who represented their own values. Ambrosius was too Roman, too pagan adjacent, too real. And third, and this is the really interesting part, Ambrosius might have succeeded. Hear me out. Heroes in legends usually have tragic flaws, right? They win their greatest victory and then die gloriously, leaving a bittersweet legacy. But what if Ambrosius actually stabilized Britain? What if he established a working system, defeated the Saxons, and then lived peacefully? Boring, unexciting, not legendary material, but legends need tragedy. They need the dying king, the impossible quest, the dramatic last stand. So maybe, just maybe, Arthur is what Ambrosius became in the cultural imagination. All the glory of his victories, stripped of the administrative drudgery. All the heroism, amplified by magic and romance. Ambrosius was the reality. Arthur became the dream. There's actually a really interesting theory about this, proposed by various historians over the years. What if Arthur wasn't one person, but a title or a composite figure? What if the legends combined Ambrosius's organizational genius with other British leaders' victories, added in some old Celtic hero tales, sprinkled in medieval romance, and created this superhero we call Arthur? Some historians have even suggested that Arthur comes from Artorius, which was a Roman family name. Guess who might have had a Roman family name? Ambrosius, the son of Romans, the last of his kind. Now, I'm not saying Ambrosius was Arthur. The evidence doesn't support that. But I am saying this. Without Ambrosius, there could be no Arthur. Ambrosius created the conditions that made the legend possible. He proved the Britons could win. He organized a resistance. He lit the spark that would eventually become the legend of Camelot. You know what this reminds me of? It's like the difference between George Washington and Captain America. Washington was real. He had bad teeth. He lost battles. He dealt with continental Congress politics and supply shortages and mutinous troops. He was human. But Captain America is the dream of what we want our founders to be. Noble, pure, impossibly heroic. Ambrosius is Washington. Arthur is Captain America. Both are important. Both serve a purpose. But only one is real. And here's what really gets to me about Ambrosius. This man, whoever he really was, didn't have to fight. He could have fled. He could have taken ship to Gaul or Spain, lived comfortably in some Roman city on the continent, married well, had children, died in peace. But he didn't. He stayed. He fought. He organized. He led. Why? Because some part of him still believed in Rome. Still believed in civilization, in law, in order, still believed that Britain could be saved, that the darkness could be held back, that the legacy of 400 years of Roman rule meant something and was worth defending. That's not legendary, that's not magical, but it's profoundly, deeply human, and in its own way, more inspiring than any tale of enchanted swords. So where did Ambrosius's war lead? What was the culmination of his life's work? Well, according to our fragmentary sources, it led to a battle. One battle. The victory that would stop the Saxon advance for an entire generation and echo through the centuries. That battle was called Badon, Mount Badon. And whether Ambrosius himself fought there, or whether he had already died and passed command to a younger leader, maybe someone named Arthur, we're about to find out. Because Mount Badon is where history and legend collide, where the real story of Britain's dark ages turns into something more, where the desperate struggles of real people become the stuff of timeless myth. So let's talk about the most important battle you've never heard of, the battle that saved Britain and created a legend, the battle that, even now, 1500 years later, historians are still arguing about. Let's talk about Badon. There's a battle that changed the course of British history, a battle so significant that it bought Britain half a century of peace, a battle that stopped the Saxon conquest dead in its tracks and gave Romano-British civilization one last precious chance to survive. And we have no idea where it happened, or when exactly, or who led the British forces, or even what it was called. Badon might not even be the real name. Welcome to Mount Badon, the most important battle nobody can find. Now I know what you're thinking. How can a battle be that important if we don't even know where it was? And that's exactly what makes this so maddening and so fascinating, because we know it happened. Every historian, even the skeptics, agrees on that. The effects were too real, too documented, too consequential to dismiss. Something happened around the year 500 AD that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Britain's Dark Ages. But the details are lost in fog and time and conflicting accounts. It's like trying to reconstruct D-Day if the only evidence you had was someone saying, "Oh yeah, there was this really big battle on a beach somewhere in France. The Allies won. It was important." Let me walk you through what we actually know, and trust me, it's a wild ride of historical detective work. First, Gildas. Always Gildas, our grumpy monk friend from the 540s. In his On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, he mentions the siege of Mount Badon, Obsessio Badonici Montis in Latin. He calls it almost the last and certainly not the least slaughter of the rascally crew. By rascally crew, he means the Saxons, because Gildas never met an insult he didn't like. But here's the crucial detail. Gildas says the siege happened in the year of his birth, and he's writing about 43 or 44 years later, so if we could figure out when Gildas was born, we'd know when Badon was fought. Simple, right? Except we don't know when Gildas was born, or when he was writing exactly. Scholars have debated this for centuries. The most commonly accepted dates put Badon somewhere between 490 and 516 AD. That's a 26-year range. Imagine if someone asked you, when did World War II start? And you answered, sometime between 1925 and 1951. Not super helpful. And Gildas doesn't tell us where Badon was, or who led the British forces. He mentions Ambrosius earlier in his text as organising the resistance, but at Badon itself, nothing. No name, no commander, just the Britons won. Thanks, Gildas. Really appreciate the detail work there. The next mention of Badon comes from the Annales Cambriae, the Welsh Annals, compiled in the 10th century but drawing on earlier sources. And this is where things get interesting. The Annals put Badon in the year 516 and say, "The Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were victorious." There he is, Arthur, finally mentioned by name in connection with Badon. But notice something. This is written at least 400 years after the battle supposedly happened. 4 centuries. That's like us today writing about events from the year 1625 based on oral tradition alone. How accurate do you think that would be? And then there's our friend Nennius, writing around 828 AD in the Historia Brittonum. He lists 12 battles that Arthur fought against the Saxons, and the 12th, the culminating victory, is Badon. According to Nennius, Arthur personally killed 960 men in a single charge at Badon. 960 men, by himself, in one battle. Now, I don't care how good a warrior you are, that's not humanly possible. That number tells us we're firmly in legend territory. The historical kernel, if there is one, has been coated in thick layers of mythological glaze. So let's step back. What can we actually deduce about Badon? What does the archaeology and geography tell us? Well, first, the name. Badon, or Badonicus in Latin. Most scholars think this refers to Bath, the Roman city of Aquae Sulis. The Anglo-Saxons called Bath Badanzasta, or Bathanziasta, the fortress of Bathan or Badon, so there's a linguistic connection. And Bath makes strategic sense. Look at a map of Britain. Bath is in the southwest, right at the edge of what was becoming Saxon territory in the late 5th century. Control Bath, and you control access to Wales and the British kingdoms in the west. It's a choke point, a crucial defensive position. Near Bath there's a place called Little Salisbury Hill. It's an Iron Age hill fort, one of those ancient defensive positions with earthwork walls that dot the British landscape, and archaeological excavations there have found evidence of occupation during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. The right time period, the right location, the right type of fortification for a siege. Geoffrey of Monmouth writing in the 1130s, and yes, he's mostly making things up, but sometimes he preserves genuine local traditions. He places Badon near Bath. He even has Merlin prophesy that Bath's hot springs would turn cold and poisonous, which is a weirdly specific detail to throw in there if he's just inventing everything. But, and there's always a but, some historians aren't convinced. They point to other locations. Badbury Rings in Dorset, for instance. It's a massive Iron Age hill fort with multiple ramparts. Excavations there found late Roman pottery and other artifacts from exactly the right period, 480 to 520 AD. The local name Badbury could easily be a corruption of Badon, and Badbury's position makes strategic sense too. It sits right on the border between British and Saxon territory in the late 5th century. To the east, you find Saxon burials and settlements. To the west, British. Badbury would have been a frontier fortress. Then there's Liddington Castle in Wiltshire, overlooking the village of Badbury. Yes, another Badbury. Britain apparently had multiple Badburys, because why make things easy for historians? Liddington is another hill fort, and it overlooks the Ridgeway, one of Britain's oldest roads. Control the Ridgeway, and you control north-south movement through central Britain. So we've got at least 3 plausible locations, maybe more. And without a smoking gun, a stone inscription saying Arthur was here defeated Saxons 516 AD, we can't definitively prove any of them. But here's what we can prove. Something stopped the Saxons. The archaeological record is crystal clear on this. In eastern and central Britain, you find Saxon settlements spreading steadily westward through the second half of the 5th century. Pottery, burials, building styles, they're moving west, expanding their territory. And then, right around 500 AD, that expansion stops. Just stops. For about 50 years, the Saxon advance halts. They consolidate what they have, but they don't push further west. The frontier stabilizes. That pause, that 50-year peace, that's real. That happened. And the only explanation that makes sense is a major British victory. A victory so decisive, so crushing, that it broke Saxon momentum for 2 generations. That's what Badon did. That's its historical legacy. Whether it was one battle or a series of campaigns, whether it was led by Ambrosius or Arthur or someone else entirely, whether it happened at Bath or Badbury or Liddington, those details matter less than the outcome. The Britons won, and that victory gave them time. Time to breathe, time to rebuild, time to remember who they were and what they were fighting for. Gildas, writing in the aftermath, talks about this period of peace with a mixture of relief and disappointment. He says essentially we won, we got peace, and then the next generation got soft and complacent and started civil wars among themselves. Classic Gildas, always finding something to complain about. But think about what that 50 years meant. If you were born in British territory in, say, 510 AD, just after Badon, you could grow up, live your entire adult life, and grow old without ever seeing a Saxon invasion. You could raise your children in peace, farm your land, maybe even maintain some of that Roman culture, those Latin literacy skills, those Christian traditions. That's what Badon brought. Not victory forever, but a generation of peace, a chance. And here's something I find incredibly moving. That generation of peace is probably when the Arthur legend really took root. Think about it. You've got grandparents telling stories to their grandchildren. When I was young, before you were born, we were losing. The Saxons were winning. We thought it was over. But then there was this battle, this glorious victory, and everything changed. There was this warrior, maybe you've heard of him, named Arthur. Stories told by firelight. Stories about hope when all seemed lost. Stories about heroes who saved Britain. And with each telling, the details get a little hazier. The hero gets a little grander. The victory gets a little more miraculous. History becomes legend. Legend becomes myth. But here's the question that keeps historians up at night. Was there really an Arthur at Badon? Or is Arthur what we call the collective victory? Is he a title, a symbol, a name given later to explain something that seemed miraculous? The honest answer is, we don't know. Gildas, writing closest to the events, doesn't mention Arthur at all. He mentions Ambrosius, and he mentions Badon, but no Arthur. Does that mean Arthur wasn't there? Or does it mean something else? Some scholars suggest that Arthur comes from the Roman name Artorius, and maybe there was a British leader with that name. Others think Arthur might have been a title. Arth means bear in Welsh, so maybe Arthur meant the bear, a nickname for a fierce warrior. Still others think Arthur is purely legendary, a composite figure created centuries later by combining various British heroes. The medieval Welsh poet who compiled the Annales Cambriae added one more detail that's haunting. He lists not just Badon, but also Arthur's death. He places it at the Battle of Camlan in 537 AD, 21 years after Badon, where Arthur and Medraut, Mordred in later tales, both fell. Whether that's history or invention we'll never know. But what strikes me is the symmetry. Arthur appears in history for one battle, Badon, the great victory, and he disappears in another, Camlan, the tragic end. Birth and death, glory and fall. It's almost too perfect, too story-shaped, and maybe that's the point. Maybe Arthur is Britain's way of making sense of this period. The chaos, the victories, the temporary salvation, and the eventual loss, all wrapped up in one figure, one name, one legend. But regardless of whether Arthur was real, Badon was real. That victory was real. And its effects rippled through British history for centuries. It gave birth to legends, yes, but it also gave Britain something more precious. Time. Time to remember. Time to preserve. Time to hope. You know what I think the real tragedy is? It's not that we don't know who won Badon. It's that we needed a legend to remember that someone did. That the victory itself, the actual historical real-world achievement of stopping the Saxon advance and saving Romano-British civilization for another generation, that wasn't enough. We needed magic swords and wizard advisors and round tables to make it stick in cultural memory. Maybe that says something about us, about how we need our heroes to be superhuman to take them seriously, about how reality, no matter how remarkable, always seems to fall short of fantasy. Or maybe, and I kind of like this interpretation, maybe Arthur is every British warrior who fought at Badon. every soldier who held the line, every commander who made the right decision, every scout who warned of the Saxon approach, every villager who brought supplies, every person who chose to stand and fight instead of fleeing west. Maybe Arthur isn't one man. Maybe Arthur is all of them. The collective courage of a people refusing to surrender. And if that's true, then the legend isn't a distortion of history, it's history's truest expression. But while we've been talking about battles and warriors and legendary victories in the mist, something else was happening in Britain. Something that would completely change our understanding of this period. Because while the East was struggling with Saxon settlement, and the Britons were fighting for survival, the West, the far west of Britain, was doing something unexpected. It was thriving, trading, building, creating a sophisticated cosmopolitan culture that stayed connected to the Mediterranean world even as the rest of Britain fell into chaos. And the centre of that world, the jewel of Western Britain, was a windswept peninsula in Cornwall, a rocky headland jutting into the Atlantic, a place that Geoffrey of Monmouth would later claim was Arthur's birthplace. Its name was Tintagel, and what archaeologists have found there in recent years has rewritten everything we thought we knew about Britain's Dark Ages. So let's go there now. Let's leave the battlefield and travel to the coast. Let's discover the palace that shouldn't exist, the trade that shouldn't have been possible, and the world that the darkness never quite reached. Imagine standing on a windswept cliff in Cornwall, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. Waves crash against black rocks hundreds of feet below. Salt spray stings your face. Behind you, the ruins of a medieval castle cling to the headland. Romantic, picturesque, exactly the kind of place where legends should be born. This is Tintagel. And for centuries people dismissed it as pure fantasy. A pretty backdrop for Geoffrey of Monmouth's medieval stories about King Arthur. Sure, there's a castle, but it was built in the 1230s, 700 years after Arthur supposedly lived. So obviously the Arthur connection was nonsense. Medieval propaganda, romantic invention. And then, in the summer of 2016, archaeologists started digging in a part of the island that had never been excavated before. And what they found changed everything. Let me tell you about the discovery that made headlines around the world and forced historians to completely rethink what Britain's Dark Ages actually looked like. It started with a fire. Back in the 1980s, a brush fire on Tintagel Island burned away vegetation and topsoil, and suddenly, archaeologists could see the outlines of structures that had been invisible for centuries. Not the medieval castle, these were much older. Stone foundations poking through the earth. Lots of them. Way more than anyone expected. But funding for archaeology is always tight, and Tintagel had been studied before in the 1930s by a guy named Raleg Radford. Radford thought the old foundations were from a monastery, just a small religious community, nothing special. So for decades that's what the textbook said. Tintagel, site of a minor Dark Ages monastery. Except Radford was wrong. Spectacularly, magnificently wrong. In 2016, English Heritage finally got funding for a major 5-year excavation project. They brought in Cornwall Archaeological Unit, used ground-penetrating radar to map the site, and on July 18, 2016, they opened their first trenches, and within days, literally days, they knew they'd found something extraordinary. The archaeologists weren't looking at a monastery, they were looking at a palace. A massive, sophisticated, wealthy palace complex from the 5th and 6th centuries, the absolute heart of the so-called Dark Ages. Dr. Wyn Scutt, one of the lead archaeologists, described the moment they realised what they had. He said it was like the earth itself was revealing a secret it had kept for 1,500 years. Because these weren't rough stone huts, These were substantial buildings with thick walls, some of them over 3 feet wide, buildings with multiple rooms, paved floors, carefully constructed drainage systems, buildings that required planning, resources, skilled labourers, and serious wealth to construct. And here's the kicker. There weren't just a few buildings, there were more than 100, over 100 stone structures crowded onto this dramatic headland, a settlement of hundreds, maybe thousands of people at its height in the 5th and 6th centuries, during the Dark Ages, in supposedly barbaric collapsing post-Roman Britain. Let that sink in for a moment. While Eastern Britain was struggling with Saxon settlement and the collapse of Roman infrastructure, Western Britain was building stone palaces. But the buildings themselves, as impressive as they are, weren't the most shocking discovery. It was what was inside them, what was scattered across the site in such quantities that the archaeologists couldn't believe what they were seeing. Pottery, thousands of fragments of pottery, but not local British pottery, not rough handmade stuff. No, this was fine pottery from the Mediterranean, specifically from modern-day Turkey, Tunisia, Greece and North Africa. Amphora fragments, those big clay jars the Romans used for shipping that once contained wine and olive oil. Fancy serving dishes called African red slipware. Elegant bowls, decorated plates, and glass. Oh, the glass. Fragments of fine glassware from France. Not just any glass, but beautifully painted, delicate glass cups and vessels. The kind of stuff you'd find at a wealthy Roman villa or in the home of a Byzantine merchant. The kind of stuff that's expensive, fragile, and completely unnecessary unless you're trying to impress people. Dr. Rachel Cubitt, who analysed the pottery, described it as the biggest hoard of 5th and 6th century Mediterranean pottery ever found in Britain. The biggest, not in Cornwall, not in Western Britain, in all of Britain. Tintagel had more imported Mediterranean goods than any other site from this period. Think about what that means. Think about the logistics involved. We're talking about the year 500 AD, give or take. The Roman Empire has collapsed. The Mediterranean is supposedly cut off. Trade networks are supposed to have broken down. Britain is supposed to be isolated, barbaric, declining. And yet, somehow, merchants from Turkey and North Africa and Greece are shipping luxury goods, wine, olive oil, fancy tableware, across thousands of miles of ocean to a rocky peninsula in Cornwall. Why? Because someone at Tintagel had the wealth to buy them, and the connections to arrange the trade, and the desire for these luxury items that said, we're still civilized, we still matter, we're still part of the wider world. It gets better. In 1998, before the big excavations, someone found a piece of slate with an inscription carved into it. Latin words. The slate became known as the Archaeology stone, and the inscription is fragmentary, but it seems to say something like, Archaeology, descendant of Powys, made this. Just a name, just a piece of someone's work. But here's why it matters. It proves Latin literacy survived at Tintagel in the 6th century. People could still read and write in Latin. They were educated. They maintained that Roman tradition of literacy even as it was vanishing in much of Britain. And then, in 2017, the archaeologists found another inscribed slate. This one's even more remarkable. It's a windowsill or lintel stone with inscriptions in Latin, Greek, and early Celtic languages all mixed together. Names, symbols, maybe prayers or dedications. It's like finding a Rosetta Stone for post-Roman Britain. It shows a multilingual, literate, culturally sophisticated community. One of the archaeologists, Jacqueline Nowakowski, said something that really stuck with me. She said, "Every time we put a trowel in the ground at Tintagel, we find evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about the Dark Ages. Because it's not just the quantity of stuff, it's the quality. It's the fact that this wasn't a brief moment of prosperity. The evidence spans decades, maybe a century or more, generation after generation at Tintagel, living in stone buildings, drinking Mediterranean wine, eating from North African plates, remaining connected to the wider world while the rest of Britain was fragmenting. So who lived here? Who had this kind of wealth and power? The consensus among historians is that Tintagel was the seasonal residence, maybe the main seat, of the kings of Dumnonia. Dumnonia was the kingdom that covered Cornwall, Devon, and parts of Somerset. It was one of the surviving British kingdoms that the Saxons never conquered, and clearly it was doing just fine. More than fine, it was thriving. Dumnonian kings were wealthy enough to import luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. They maintained trade routes that stretched from Cornwall to Constantinople. They built in stone at a time when most of Britain was building in wood and thatch. They preserved Latin literacy when it was dying elsewhere. And here's something I find absolutely fascinating: the location. Tintagel isn't in a valley or on a plain where it would be easy to build. It's on this impossibly dramatic headland, connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land. It's difficult to access, exposed to the elements, and utterly spectacular. Why build there? Because it's a statement. It says, "We are powerful enough to build wherever we want. We command the sea lanes. We control Atlantic trade. This headland, this impossible location belongs to us." It's pure power display, medieval equivalent of building a palace on top of a mountain just because you can. The trade network that sustained Tintagel is almost as impressive as the site itself. Recent research has mapped out what archaeologists call the Atlantic trade network. Ships sailed from the Mediterranean around Spain and Portugal, up the Atlantic coast, stopping at Tintagel, then continuing north to Wales, Ireland and Scotland. Cornwall was a hub, a connection point between the Mediterranean and the Celtic Atlantic world. Why Cornwall? 2 reasons. First, tin. Cornwall had been famous for tin mining since the Bronze Age. The Romans mined Cornish tin for centuries. And after Rome fell, Mediterranean merchants still wanted it. Tin is essential for making bronze, and bronze is essential for everything from weapons to tableware to church bells. Second, geography. If you're sailing from the Mediterranean to Ireland or Scotland, Cornwall is right on the way. It's a natural stopping point, a place to resupply, trade, rest before continuing north. So Tintagel became a cosmopolitan trading port. Imagine the scene: ships from Greece pulling into the harbour, merchants speaking Greek, Latin, maybe some early forms of Arabic or Syriac, local British nobles speaking Old Welsh or Latin, Irish traders, maybe some Britons from Wales, all gathered at this windswept palace to trade, negotiate, feast and deal. It would have been noisy, colourful, chaotic. The smell of foreign spices, exotic food, salt water and horses. The sight of different styles of clothing, different ships in the harbour, different languages being shouted across the docks. This wasn't a dark age. This was a golden age, at least for Tintagel. And the feasting. Oh, the feasting. Archaeologists found evidence of massive feasts at Tintagel. Thousands of animal bones, cattle, pigs, sheep. These people were eating well. Roasted meat, imported wine, olive oil for cooking, fine pottery to serve it on. The rulers of Dumnonia were living like Roman aristocrats, even though Rome was gone. There's even evidence of glassworking on site. They weren't just importing glass, they were making it, repairing it, maybe even creating new pieces. That requires serious technical knowledge and specialised craftsmen. So why don't we hear about Tintagel in the historical records? Why doesn't Gildas mention it? Why doesn't Bede? Probably because it was normal to them. Tintagel was just where the Dumnonian kings lived. It would be like asking why medieval chronicles don't constantly mention that the king lives in a palace in London. It's assumed, it's background information, but for us discovering Tintagel is revolutionary, because it destroys the myth of the Dark Ages. It proves that parts of Britain, specifically Western Britain, weren't dark at all. They were sophisticated, wealthy, internationally connected, and culturally vibrant. The darkness, it turns out, is mostly in our understanding. The written records vanished, so we assumed everything vanished. But the archaeology tells a different story, a story of regional variation, of some places suffering while others thrived, of complexity, not simple collapse. And here's where it gets really interesting. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 1130s, claimed that Tintagel was where King Arthur was conceived. According to Geoffrey's story, Uther Pendragon besieged Tintagel to win a grain, and through Merlin's magic, Arthur was conceived there. For centuries, historians dismissed this as pure fantasy. There was nothing at Tintagel from Arthur's supposed time period, just medieval ruins. But now we know that Tintagel was indeed a royal residence in the 5th and 6th centuries. It was indeed the seat of powerful British kings. It was indeed exactly the kind of place where a legendary king might have originated. Does that prove Arthur was born at Tintagel? Of course not. But it proves Geoffrey didn't just make up everything. He was writing 700 years after the fact, but he preserved a genuine tradition, that Tintagel was important in the Dark Ages, that it was royal, that it mattered. Maybe, just maybe, the Arthur legend really did start in Dumnonia, at this windswept palace on the edge of the Atlantic. Maybe one of those Dumnonian kings, feasting on imported wine and olives, leading his warriors, maintaining Latin culture, was the seed from which the legend grew. Or maybe Arthur was always a composite, a symbol of all the British kings who resisted, who maintained civilization, who refused to let the darkness win, and Tintagel, with its improbable grandeur, became the perfect birthplace for such a legend. Either way, standing on those cliffs, looking out at the Atlantic, knowing that 1500 years ago this was a bustling, wealthy, cosmopolitan centre of power, it changes how you think about history, about legends, about what's possible in the darkest times, because Tintagel teaches us something profound. Even when the world seems to be collapsing, even when civilization seems to be ending, somewhere, maybe in an unexpected place, maybe on the margins, people are building, trading, creating, refusing to surrender to the darkness. That's the real legacy of Tintagel, not the Arthur legend, beautiful as it is, but the historical reality, the proof that Britain's Dark Ages weren't uniformly dark. That resistance took many forms. That survival sometimes meant holding on to your connection to the wider world, importing wine from Turkey, building palaces on impossible cliffs, and showing anyone who would look, we're still here. We still matter. We still remember who we are. But while Tintagel shows us what's possible in the West, it also highlights something crucial. Britain was divided, not just politically, but culturally, fundamentally. The Britain of Tintagel and the Britain of the Saxon settlements were becoming two different worlds, two different peoples, two different futures, and that division, that cultural frontier running through the heart of Britain, is the key to understanding everything that came next. The battles, the legends, and yes, even Arthur himself. Because Arthur, whether he was real or not, represents something essential. The British resistance to that division. The desperate attempt to hold Britain together, to stop the Saxons, to preserve what Tintagel represents. But who was Arthur really? Not the legend. We've spent enough time with the fantasy. Who was the man, if there was a man? What can we actually say about the historical figure behind the greatest legend Britain ever produced? Let's find out. Let's strip away the romance and the magic and the medieval embellishments. Let's look at what the earlier sources actually tell us about a war leader named Arthur, and see if we can find the human being underneath the myth. Let's play a game. I'm going to describe someone to you, and you tell me if this sounds like King Arthur. He's not a king. He doesn't have a castle. There's no round table, no Camelot, no Guinevere. He's never pulled a sword from a stone. There's no Merlin giving him advice, no knights in shining armour, no quests for holy grails. He's dirty, exhausted, probably in his 40s, wearing whatever armour he could scavenge or repair. He commands a mixed force of cavalry and infantry, ex-Roman soldiers, British tribal warriors, maybe some mercenaries. He's fighting a defensive war, trying to hold territory rather than conquer it. He's probably functionally illiterate, though he might know enough Latin for military commands. He lives in a hall, not a palace. He eats with his hands. He's seen friends die. He's killed men himself up close, and it haunts him. Is this King Arthur? According to the earliest sources we have, yes. That might be Arthur, or at least that's the kind of man Arthur would have been if he existed at all. Welcome to the real Arthur, or rather, to the ghost of a possibility that might have been a man named Arthur. It's complicated. Let's untangle it. The first text that actually names Arthur and gives him any detail is the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons, written around 828 AD. That's more than 300 years after Arthur supposedly lived. 3 centuries. Long enough for truth to become legend, for legend to become myth, for myth to become, well, whatever Arthur had become by the 9th century. But let's look at what the Historia Brittonum actually says, because it's fascinating. The text lists 12 battles that Arthur fought, and here's the exact Latin phrase used to describe him. Dux bellorum, not rex, not king. Dux bellorum, war leader, commander of battles. That's a huge distinction. Arthur, in the earliest detailed account we have, isn't a king at all. He's a military commander, a general basically. The Historia says he fought with the kings of the Britons against the Saxons, but he himself was the leader of battles. Read that again. With the kings. Not as a king, but alongside them. Arthur was apparently someone the various British kings accepted as their military commander, a supreme commander in modern terms, someone who coordinated the efforts of multiple kingdoms, each with their own king, their own warriors, their own agenda. And that actually makes historical sense. Remember, post-Roman Britain was fragmented into multiple small kingdoms, each one jealous of the others, each one reluctant to submit to anyone else's authority. But when facing an existential threat, the Saxon expansion, they might have been willing to accept a neutral military leader, someone with no kingdom of his own to favour, someone whose only job was to win battles. Think of it like, okay, imagine if the American colonies, before they unified, were being invaded. Each colony has its own government, its own governor, its own militia. They're all arguing with each other, but they agree to appoint one military commander, someone like George Washington, to coordinate their defence. That person isn't the king of any colony. He's just the general, the war leader. That might have been Arthur. A dux bellorum, accepted by multiple British kings because he was effective, because he won battles, because he was their best chance at survival. The Historia Brittonum lists those 12 battles Arthur supposedly fought. Most of the locations are impossible to identify now. The names are in Old Welsh or Latin, and they don't match any modern places we can pinpoint. But they're scattered across Britain, from Scotland to southern England, which suggests Arthur, if this is historical, was leading a mobile force, going wherever the threat was greatest. And here's something really interesting about that list. The battles aren't conquests. They're not Arthur expanding territory or building an empire. They're defensive. They're holding the line, protecting. That fits with what we know about the British position in the late 5th century. They weren't winning back-lost territory. They were desperately trying to keep what they had. Now, about that name. Arthur. Where does it come from? The most widely accepted theory is that it derives from the Roman family name Artorius. During the Roman occupation of Britain, Latin names were common among the British elite. Even after Rome left, Romano-British families like Ambrosius's, would have kept Roman naming traditions. So, Arthur or Artorius as a British name makes sense. There was actually a real Roman officer named Lucius Artorius Castus, who served in Britain during the 2nd century. He commanded Sarmatian cavalry, heavy armoured horsemen from the region around the Black Sea. Some historians, notably C. Scott Littleton and Linda Malcor, suggested that this Artorius might be the origin of the Arthur legend, that stories about him got passed down and eventually merged with tales of a later British leader. It's possible, but it's also speculation. Artorius Castus lived 300 years before the Arthur of legend. That's a long time for a story to survive, and there's no direct evidence connecting them. It's like suggesting that a Roman general from the year 200 inspired legends that appeared in the year 500. Could it happen? Maybe. Can we prove it? No. Another candidate that gets brought up is Reothamus. Remember him? We mentioned him briefly when talking about Ambrosius. Reothamus was a British king, or High King, the title is debated, who crossed to Gaul around 470 AD to fight alongside the Romans against the Goths. The Byzantine historian Jordanes wrote about him. Here's why Reothamus is interesting. Reothamus might not be a name, it might be a title. It comes from Celtic roots meaning something like supreme king or highest chief. So maybe Reothamus was what people called Arthur. Maybe Arthur was his real name, and Reothamus was his title. After his defeat in Gaul, Reothamus disappeared into Burgundian territory. The last place he was known to be heading was near a town called Avalon. Yes, Avalon, like Avalon, where Arthur was supposedly taken to heal from his wounds. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's a tantalizing maybe. Historian Geoffrey Ashe has championed the Reothamus theory for decades, and honestly, it's one of the more plausible identifications. The dates work, the geography works, the title works, even the Avalon connection works. But, and there's always a but, we don't know enough about Reothamus to say definitively. He appears briefly in the historical record and then vanishes. We don't know if he ever returned to Britain. We don't know if he fought at Badon. We don't know if anyone in Britain even remembered him. Then there's the composite theory, which is probably closest to the truth. This theory says Arthur isn't one person. He's a legendary figure created by combining multiple historical British leaders. Maybe Ambrosius's organisational genius, maybe Reothamus's campaign in Gaul, maybe another leader's victory at Badon, maybe a different commander's cavalry tactics. All blended together over centuries of storytelling until they became Arthur. It's like if future historians looking back at World War II with only fragments of information combined Eisenhower, Patton and Montgomery into one super general named Arthur who won the war. Each contributed something, but the legend is bigger than any individual. Dr. Thomas Charles Edwards, a renowned medieval historian, summed it up perfectly. At this stage of the inquiry, one can only say that there may well have been a historical Arthur, but the historian can as yet say nothing of value about him. That's sobering, isn't it? After all this searching, all this speculation, the honest answer is, we don't know. Maybe he was real. Maybe he wasn't. and if he was real, we know almost nothing about him beyond a name and a role. But here's what I find beautiful about that uncertainty. It means Arthur can be whatever we need him to be. For the Britons fighting for survival in the 6th century, he was hope. For medieval kings seeking legitimacy, he was an ideal of kingship. For modern audiences, he's a symbol of honour, justice, and sacrifice. The mystery is what makes the legend immortal. Yet I can't help but wonder about the man, if there was a man. What was he really like? Not the legend, but the human being. Did he doubt himself? Did he lie awake at night wondering if the next battle would be the one he lost? Did he carry guilt for the men who died under his command? Did he have a family? Children? Did they remember him, or did they die not knowing their father would become legend? Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The earliest Arthur, the Arthur of the Historia Brittonum, doesn't have a happy ending. The Welsh Annals, compiled around the same time, record his death at the Battle of Camlan in 537 AD. No mystical Avalon, no once and future king, just death in battle, like so many warriors before and after him. The entry is stark. The Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medraut fell. That's it. Both Arthur and Medraut, later Mordred, killed. Both sides losing. A mutual destruction that left Britain weaker. Not a glorious last stand, but a tragedy. A civil war, possibly, or an ambush, or a betrayal. We don't know, but it's not heroic. It's just loss. And maybe that's the most human thing about Arthur. If he existed, he failed. The Saxons, stopped temporarily by Badon, eventually conquered most of Britain anyway. The Romano-British civilization Arthur supposedly defended, it faded. The unity he might have created, it fractured. Within a century of his death, Saxon kingdoms dominated eastern and central Britain, and the Britons were pushed to the margins. Arthur didn't save Britain. He just bought it time, a generation of peace, one last gasp before the inevitable. But you know what? That might be enough. That might be heroic in itself. Fighting not because you'll win, but because it's the right thing to do. Holding the line not for glory, but for the people behind you. Knowing you can't stop the tide, but standing against it anyway. There's a quote from Tolkien. And yes, I know, quoting Tolkien when discussing the historical Arthur is a bit on the nose, but bear with me. Tolkien wrote, "I am a Christian, and indeed a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains some samples or glimpses of final victory." The historical Arthur, if he existed, lived that long defeat. He won battles, yes. He might have been brilliant, brave, inspiring. But in the end, history moved on without him. The Saxons won. Britain became England. The Romano-British culture Arthur defended became a memory, then a legend, then a fantasy. But within that long defeat, there were those glimpses of victory. Badon, the 50 years of peace, the preservation of British culture in the West, the survival of Christianity, the seeds that would eventually grow into Wales, into Cornish culture, into the rich tapestry of British identity that includes both Celtic and Saxon threads. Maybe Arthur, real or not, represents something fundamental about the human spirit. The refusal to surrender, the determination to fight even when losing, the belief that how we resist matters, even if we ultimately fail. I think that's why the legend survives. Not because Arthur was a perfect king with a magic sword, but because he represents, or the stories about him represent, ordinary people doing extraordinary things in desperate times, choosing to stand when they could flee, choosing to fight when they could submit, choosing hope over despair. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth about historical Arthur. If he was real, He was just a man, flawed, limited, mortal. He made decisions, some good and some bad. He won some battles and lost others. He lived, he fought, and he died. Like all of us will. No magic saved him. No destiny guided him. He was human. But the story of that human, the courage it took to resist, the leadership required to unite fractured kingdoms, the vision to see that Romano-British civilization was worth defending, that story was so powerful it survived 1,500 years. That story became Arthur. So was there a real Arthur? Honestly, I think there probably was. Not a king, just a war leader. Not Camelot, just a hall somewhere in Western Britain. Not Excalibur, just a good sword. Not knights in shining armour, just loyal companions. Not immortality, just a man doing his best in the worst of times, and his reward for that courage, for that sacrifice. His name survived. Not attached to accurate history, but to legend. Not remembered as he was, but as people needed him to be. That's both the tragedy and the triumph of Arthur. The man was forgotten, but the meaning of his life, the refusal to surrender that became immortal. But while we've been searching for Arthur the individual, we've been overlooking something crucial. Because the story of Britain's Dark Ages isn't just about one hero or one battle. It's about the fundamental division that tore Britain in half. A division that created two different worlds on one island. Two peoples, two cultures, two futures, and understanding that division, that frontier between British and Saxon, between West and East, is the key to understanding why the Arthur legend mattered so much, why it survived when so much else was forgotten, why it still resonates today. Because Arthur, whether real or legendary, represents the British side of that divide, the people who lost, the people whose language, whose culture, whose very identity was being erased. And the legend of Arthur was their way of saying, we were here, we mattered, we resisted, don't forget us. So let's look at that divided Britain. Let's see how one island became two worlds, and let's understand what was really at stake in those Dark Ages battles. Draw a line across Britain, start in the north, somewhere around the River Humber. Draw it south and west, curving through what's now the Midlands, down toward the Bristol Channel. Not a straight line, more like a jagged frontier, shifting year by year, battle by battle. On one side of that line, people spoke early Welsh or Cornish. They were Christian. They remembered Rome. They tried to maintain Latin literacy. They built in stone when they could. They drank Mediterranean wine. They looked west to Ireland and south to Gaul for trade and alliance. On the other side of that line, people spoke Old English, the ancestor of the language you're hearing right now. They were pagan, worshipping Woden and Thor. They'd never known Rome. They built in wood and thatch. They drank beer and mead. They buried their dead with grave goods, swords, shields, jewellery for the afterlife. They looked east to Germany and Scandinavia. Same island, same century, two completely different worlds. And the question is, how? How did Britain split so completely that within 100 years the two sides could barely understand each other? Because this wasn't just politics. This was identity, culture, religion, language, everything that makes a people who they are. And understanding this divide, this frontier, is crucial to understanding why the Arthur legend mattered so much and why it survives today. Let's start with something tangible, something we can dig up and hold in our hands, the dead. When archaeologists excavate burial sites from 6th century Britain, they can immediately tell which side of the divide they're on, and I mean immediately. Before any radiocarbon dating, before any DNA analysis, just by looking at how people were buried. In eastern Britain, Saxon Britain, they find pagan cemeteries, bodies laid out carefully, oriented east-west. But here's the key, they're buried with stuff. Grave goods. A warrior might be buried with his sword, his shield, his spear, maybe a bronze bowl for feasting in Valhalla. Women are buried with brooches, beads, sometimes spinning equipment. Children get toys, beads, little amulets. Everyone gets something for the journey to the afterlife. These burials are fascinating because they tell us what the Saxons valued. Dr. Catherine Hills from Cambridge has spent decades excavating Saxon cemeteries, and she points out something really interesting. The grave goods aren't random. They're carefully chosen. A warrior's identity is his weapons. A woman's identity might be expressed through elaborate jewellery that shows her status, her family connections. These burials are saying, "This is who I was. Remember me this way." Now cross that invisible line into Western Britain. British burials, Christian burials, and they're completely different. Bodies oriented east-west still, but that's for Christian reasons, facing the rising sun, the direction of resurrection. No grave goods, or almost none. Maybe a simple cross, a shroud pin. That's it. Christian theology said you can't take it with you, and besides, the resurrection of the body means you don't need stuff for the afterlife. You're coming back. It's the same theological divide that separated early Christians from Romans. Christians buried their dead simply, without goods, in marked graves. Pagans cremated or buried with elaborate grave goods. In 6th century Britain, that divide has mapped itself onto geography. But it's not just burials, it's everything. Language, for instance. If you could somehow time travel to Britain in the year 550 and walk from Kent to Cornwall, you'd experience something bizarre. In Kent, you'd hear Old English. If you speak modern English, you'd recognise some words: father, mother, house, sun, moon. Basic vocabulary that hasn't changed much in 1500 years. The grammar would be weird, the pronunciation would be rough, but you'd catch fragments. But keep walking west, cross that frontier, and suddenly you wouldn't understand a word. The locals are speaking early Welsh, or Brythonic to be technical. It sounds completely different. It is completely different. Welsh is a Celtic language, related to Irish and Breton and distantly to Gaulish. It has nothing to do with Germanic languages, and here's what's wild. Just a century earlier, most of Britain spoke Brythonic. It was the dominant language from Scotland to Cornwall. But by 550 AD, it's been pushed west, and Old English is taking over the east. Language doesn't usually shift that fast, not without massive population replacement or intense cultural pressure. So what happened? Did the Saxons kill everyone and replace them? The old narrative said yes. The Anglo-Saxon invasion was genocidal. They wiped out the native Britons. But modern DNA studies tell a different story, and it's complicated. Geneticists have analysed ancient DNA from Saxon period burials across Britain, and what they've found is messy. In some areas, especially eastern England, there's substantial genetic continuity with Germanic populations, meaning yes, significant numbers of people migrated from Germany and Denmark, but in other areas, the genetic profile is more mixed. British ancestry remains, but culturally these people became Saxon. Let that sink in. British people, genetically British, becoming culturally Saxon, speaking Old English, worshipping pagan gods, burying their dead with grave goods. What happened? Why would you abandon your own culture? Dr. Mark Thomas at UCL has studied this extensively, and his theory is both simple and disturbing. If you wanted to survive and thrive in Saxon-controlled territory, you became Saxon. You learned the language, You adopted the customs. You maybe even took a Saxon name, because the alternative was being second class, being the outsider, being the conquered. It's cultural assimilation, and it happens throughout history. It's happening right now, in fact, all over the world. Minority cultures absorbed by dominant ones, not through genocide necessarily, but through economics, social pressure, intermarriage, and the simple fact that life is easier if you speak the language of the people in power. But some people didn't assimilate. Some people held the line. In the West, in Wales, in Cornwall, in parts of Cumbria, the Britons remained British. They kept speaking Welsh. They stayed Christian. They maintained their identity. And that's where the frontier hardened. Archaeological evidence shows this divide clearly. In eastern Britain you find Saxon-style settlements, Grubenhäuser, sunken floor buildings used for storage or workshops, long wooden halls for feasting, pagan temples, or at least ritual sites, pottery made in the Saxon style. Everything screams Germanic culture. In Western Britain you find continued Roman British styles, stone buildings where possible, churches, not temples, different pottery, different metalwork. Even the way they farmed was different. Saxons used different field systems, different ploughing techniques. And the two sides? They didn't mix much. Trade across the frontier was limited. Intermarriage was rare. Written sources from both sides, when they exist, describe the other as aliens, foreigners, the enemy. Gildas, writing from the British side, calls the Saxons that foul tribe and barbarians. He describes them with disgust, as if they're barely human. Now Gildas is biased. Remember, he's writing a religious polemic, not a neutral history, but his attitude reflects real British feelings. The Saxons weren't just invaders. They were wrong, culturally wrong, religiously wrong. They represented everything the Britons were fighting against. And the Saxons, well, we have less from their perspective because they didn't write much down. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled centuries later but drawing on earlier traditions, barely mentions the Britons, and when it does, it's dismissive. The word they use, Wheelus, means foreigners or slaves. That's where the word Welsh comes from. The Saxons called the native British people of Britain foreigners in their own land. That's colonizer logic right there. We've been here for 3 generations now, so this is our land, and you're the outsiders. It's infuriating when you think about it, but it's also very human. Every conquering culture does this. They rewrite the narrative so they're the natives, and the actual natives are foreigners. So by 550 AD, Britain isn't just politically divided, it's psychologically divided, culturally divided. These are two peoples who can barely communicate and don't want to. And that divide is the context for everything. The battles, the legends, the politics. Now here's something fascinating. Both sides thought they were civilized, and the other side was barbaric. The Britons looked at the Saxons and saw pagans, illiterates, barbarians who couldn't even build in stone. The Saxons looked at the Britons and saw a weak, defeated people clinging to the ruins of Rome, unable to adapt or move forward. And you know what? Both were kind of wrong. Because neither side was barbaric. Saxon society was actually quite sophisticated. They had complex legal codes, elaborate kinship structures, skilled craftspeople. Their metalwork, the jewellery, the weapons, was extraordinarily beautiful. Intricate designs, gold filigree work, inlaid garnets. Museums are full of Saxon treasures that would make any Roman goldsmith jealous. And they had oral poetry, epic poems about heroes and battles passed down through generations. We only have fragments, Most of it was lost when the Saxons converted to Christianity and stopped valuing pagan oral traditions. But what survives, like Beowulf, shows sophisticated storytelling, complex meters, deep philosophical themes. These weren't barbarians. They were a pre-literate culture, which is different. Meanwhile, the Britons weren't pathetic holdouts living in Roman ruins. Yes, they'd lost ground. Yes, their population had declined. But Western Britain, as we saw at Tintagel, was actually doing okay. Trading with the Mediterranean, maintaining literacy, building new churches. They were adapting, surviving, even thriving in some places. So really, this divide was between two different but equally valid ways of being civilized. The Britons represented Roman Christian civilization, Latin, literacy, stone architecture, Mediterranean connections. The Saxons represented Germanic tribal civilization, oral culture, kinship bonds, warrior ethos, Northern European connections. Neither was superior. They were just different. But they couldn't coexist, not peacefully, not on the same island. Because the fundamental values, the religious worldview, the language, the cultural priorities, were incompatible. And that's the real tragedy of Dark Ages Britain. It's not that barbarians destroyed civilization. It's that two civilizations collided and only one could survive, at least in eastern Britain. The loser was pushed to the margins, to Wales, to Cornwall, where they preserved their identity but lost their homeland. Have you ever been in a situation where two groups just fundamentally can't understand each other? Where both sides are convinced they're right, and the other side is not just wrong, but incomprehensibly wrong? That's what 6th century Britain was like. Except instead of arguing online, they were fighting wars. The British-Saxon frontier wasn't just a military border, it was a cultural firebreak. Cross it one way, and you entered Christian Britain, where people spoke Welsh, remembered Rome, and looked to the continent for trade and culture. Cross it the other way, and you entered pagan England, where people spoke Old English, worshipped Germanic gods, and looked to Scandinavia for their roots. And Arthur, if he existed, lived on that frontier, fought on that frontier, died on that frontier probably. He was, in a sense, the embodiment of the British resistance to that divide. The man trying to hold Britain together when it was tearing itself in half. No wonder his legend survived. No wonder the Britons, the people who became the Welsh, the Cornish, the Bretons, kept telling his story, because Arthur represented the moment when they almost won, when they held the line, when Britain might have stayed British. But they didn't win. The Saxons won, and Britain became England, Angleland. The language you're hearing right now, that's the language of the winners. English is a Germanic language with Latin vocabulary bolted on later. If the Britons had won, you'd be speaking Welsh, or something close to it. Think about that. The language in your head, the words you think with, the way you structure sentences, it's all because of that 5th and 6th century cultural divide. Because the Saxons won and imposed their language on Britain. That's how deep this goes. That's how much it mattered. But here's the twist. Even though the Saxons won, even though their language and culture dominated, the legend of Arthur, the British hero, never died. In fact, it grew. It spread. It became so powerful that even the descendants of the Saxons centuries later claimed Arthur as their own. English kings, speaking English, ruling from London, invoked Arthur's name for legitimacy. The Britons lost the war but won the cultural memory. Arthur, whether real or not, became more influential as a legend than any Saxon king ever was as a historical figure. Can you name a Saxon king from the 6th century? Probably not, but everyone knows Arthur. That's the power of story. That's the power of meaning over mere facts. The Saxons had the military victory, the political power, the demographic advantage. but the Britons had the better story, and in the long run, the story won. There's something profound in that, about how cultures survive, about what matters more, power in the moment or memory across the centuries, about how the defeated can still shape the narrative if their story is compelling enough. And Arthur's story was compelling, is compelling, because it speaks to something universal. The refusal to surrender, the fight against impossible odds, the leader who gives everything for their people. Every culture has this story in some form, but Britain's version, Britain's hero, is Arthur. So the divided Britain of the 6th century, that frontier between two worlds, that's where Arthur matters most. Not as a historical figure, we've established we can barely prove he existed, but as a symbol, a meaning, a way for the British to say, we were here, we mattered, we fought, and our story survives even if our kingdom didn't. But how did that story survive? How did a possibly real war leader from the 6th century become the legendary king of medieval romance? How did the man, if there was a man, become the myth? That transformation is one of the most fascinating journeys in literary history, and it tells us as much about the people who retold the story as it does about the original events, because every generation that told Arthur's tale added something, changed something, made Arthur reflect their own values, their own needs, their own dreams. So let's trace that journey. Let's watch Arthur transform from whatever he might have been into what he became. From war leader to legend, from history to myth, from Dark Ages reality to medieval fantasy. It's time to see how legends are born. Sometimes a lie becomes more important than the truth. That sounds cynical, I know. But hear me out. In the year 1136, a man named Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh cleric living in Oxford, published a book. He called it Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain. And this book, this one book written by a relatively obscure churchman, would do something extraordinary. It would take whatever scattered fragments existed about Arthur and transform them into the legend we know today. And it was probably mostly fiction. Geoffrey claimed he was translating from a certain very ancient book written in the British language, meaning Welsh, that had been given to him by a friend. This mysterious sourcebook explained the entire history of Britain from its founding by Brutus, a descendant of Aeneas from Troy, all the way through to the Saxon conquest. Historians have been searching for this book for 900 years. It's never been found. Most scholars today believe Geoffrey made it up. The ancient book was a literary device to give his work authority. A way of saying, don't blame me, I'm just translating what I found. But here's the thing, it worked. Geoffrey's Historia became a medieval bestseller, and I mean a massive, phenomenal Harry Potter-level bestseller. More than 200 manuscript copies survive today, which doesn't sound like much until you realise that books had to be copied by hand, one at a time, which meant each copy cost a fortune. For 200 copies to survive to the present day means thousands must have existed originally. Within 50 years of publication, the Historia had been translated from Latin into French, then into English, then into other European languages. Kings owned copies. Nobles quoted it. Poets used it as source material. It became, for medieval Europeans, the definitive history of Britain, even though it was fantasy. Let me tell you what Geoffrey did. He took the bare-bones mentions of Arthur from earlier sources, the warrior who won 12 battles, the victory at Badon, and he expanded them into an epic saga. Suddenly Arthur wasn't just a war leader, he was a king. Not just any king, but the greatest king Britain had ever known. In Geoffrey's telling, Arthur conquers not just the Saxons but most of Europe. He defeats the Romans, the actual Roman Empire, in battle. He establishes a court that becomes the centre of civilization. He's crowned by the Archbishop of Caerleon in a ceremony attended by kings from across the known world. He's wise, just, powerful, essentially perfect. Oh, and Geoffrey added a wizard, a sorcerer named Merlin who orchestrates Arthur's conception through magic, advises him throughout his reign, and generally makes everything more mystical and mysterious. Where did Merlin come from? Geoffrey based him on Myrddin, a figure from Welsh poetry, a wild man prophet who lived in the forests and spoke in riddles. But Geoffrey transformed him into Arthur's advisor, the wise old wizard guiding the young king. It's pure invention, but it's brilliant storytelling. Geoffrey also gave Arthur a sword, not Excalibur, not yet. Geoffrey called it Caliburnus, which is probably his Latin version of a Welsh name, but this is the first time Arthur has a special named sword. Before Geoffrey, Arthur was just a warrior who presumably had a weapon. After Geoffrey, Arthur's sword becomes central to his identity and the location. Geoffrey placed Arthur's court at Caerleon in Wales, not at Camelot, that comes later. But he made it magnificent. A grand city with temples and theatres and palaces. Again, probably pure fantasy, but effective fantasy. Geoffrey also gave us the tragic end. The betrayal by Mordred, in Geoffrey's version. Mordred is Arthur's nephew who seizes the throne while Arthur is fighting in Gaul. The final battle at Camlann where both Arthur and Mordred fall. And then, and this is new, Arthur is taken to the Isle of Avalon to heal from his wounds. Not dead, not definitively, taken away, with the implication that he might return. That's Geoffrey's invention, as far as we can tell, and it's genius because it means Arthur never truly dies. He's always waiting, always about to return when Britain needs him most. Now here's the question. Why? Why did Geoffrey write this? What was he trying to accomplish? Part of it was probably just ambition. Geoffrey wanted to write something popular, something important. He saw a gap in the market. There was no comprehensive history of Britain before the Saxons, and he filled it. If 90% of it was made up, well, medieval historians weren't as concerned with accuracy as we are. They wanted edifying stories, moral lessons, entertainment. But there's also a political dimension. Geoffrey was writing in the 1130s during a period of instability in England. Stephen and Matilda were fighting over the throne, a civil war that would drag on for years. England was divided, uncertain, violent. And here comes Geoffrey with the story about a legendary king who united all of Britain, conquered foreign enemies, established justice and peace. A king whose reign represented a golden age before everything fell apart. It's not subtle. Geoffrey is basically saying, remember when we had real kings? Remember when Britain was great? Maybe we should try that again. It's propaganda, but it's effective propaganda. And various political factions jumped on it. Welsh nobles loved it because Arthur was Welsh, one of them who became greater than the English. English nobles loved it because it gave England a legendary past to rival Rome or Troy. Norman nobles loved it because it legitimized their rule. They were continuing Arthur's legacy. Everyone wanted a piece of Arthur, everyone claimed him, and the legend grew. But Geoffrey was just the beginning. Because in the late 12th century, French poets got hold of the Arthur story and transformed it again. Chrétien de Troyes, have you heard of him? He was a French poet working in the 1170s and 1180s at the court of Marie de Champagne, and Chrétien did something revolutionary. He took Geoffrey's historical epic and turned it into romance. Literally. He invented the romance genre as we know it. Chrétien wrote 5 Arthurian romances, and in them he added things that have become inseparable from the legend. Lancelot, for instance, the greatest knight, Arthur's champion, and, this is key, Guinevere's lover. The love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere and Lancelot. That's Chrétien's invention, the Holy Grail. That mystical, sacred object that the knights quest for, Chrétien introduced it. In his unfinished poem Percival, the Grail first appears as a mysterious dish at a strange castle, and the knight Percival fails to ask the right question about it. Later writers would transform it into the cup from the Last Supper, but Chrétien started it. The Round Table. Actually, this might have appeared first in a poem by a Norman poet named Wace in the 1150s, but Chrétien popularised it and gave it meaning. The idea that Arthur's knights sit at a round table so no one has precedence, so everyone is equal. That's about medieval chivalric ideals, not 6th century British reality. And Camelot. The name Camelot first appears in Chrétien's work. Before him, Arthur's court was at Caerleon or other Welsh locations. Chrétien, writing in French, called it Camelot, and the name stuck. Where is Camelot? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. It never existed. It's a literary invention, a fantasy castle that represents ideal kingship. So why did the French care about Arthur? Why did they adopt and transform a British legend? Because medieval French nobility were obsessed with chivalry, courtly love, and the ideals of knighthood. They wanted stories that exemplified these values, and Arthur's court, reimagined as a place of chivalric perfection, was the perfect setting. Chrétien's romances aren't about battles and conquests like Geoffrey's Historia. They're about individual knights going on quests, proving their worth, struggling with moral dilemmas, falling in love. They're about honour, loyalty, temptation, failure, redemption. They're psychological, emotional, complex, and audiences loved them. Manuscript copies of Chrétien's romances spread across Europe. Other poets wrote their own Arthurian tales, adding new knights, new quests, new complications. By 1200, Arthur had become a pan-European legend. Everyone from England to France to Germany to Italy was writing Arthur stories. And with each retelling, Arthur moved further from whatever historical reality might have existed. The 6th century British war leader, if he existed, was completely buried under layers of medieval fantasy. Armour became plate armour, anachronistic by centuries. Castles became stone castles with towers and moats. Knights became chivalric ideals. Ladies became damsels in distress. Magic became commonplace. The Middle Ages didn't care about historical accuracy. They cared about meaning. And Arthur meant something to them. He represented ideal kingship, perfect justice, noble sacrifice. His court represented order in a chaotic world. His knights represented chivalric values. And his tragedy, the fall of Camelot, the death of the dream, represented the gap between ideal and reality that every generation feels. Do you see what happened here? Arthur stopped being a person, if he ever was one, and became a symbol, a blank canvas onto which each culture, each generation, could project its values and dreams. The Welsh saw him as their hero, the last great British king. The English saw him as their legendary founder, proof of England's ancient glory. The French saw him as the embodiment of chivalric ideals. Everyone saw what they wanted to see, and the legend kept growing. In the 13th century, the prose Lancelot added even more complexity, expanding the Lancelot-Guinevere affair into a tragedy that destroys Camelot from within. The Vulgate cycle connected Arthur to Christian salvation history, making the Grail quest explicitly about spiritual redemption. By the 15th century, when Sir Thomas Malory wrote Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, the legend had reached its full medieval flowering. Malory, writing in English, synthesized all the French romances, all the Welsh traditions, all the English adaptations into one massive work, and that work became, for English-speaking audiences, the definitive Arthur story. Malory gave us the Arthur we think we know, noble, tragic, betrayed by those closest to him, Camelot as a golden age that couldn't last, the Round Table Fellowship destroyed by adultery and ambition, Arthur's final battle and his departure to Avalon with the promise, the hope, that he'll return. The once and future king. That phrase describing Arthur captures the essence of the legend. He was the greatest king Britain ever had, and he will return when Britain needs him most. It's a promise, a prophecy, a source of hope. But it's medieval hope, medieval values, medieval dreams. It has almost nothing to do with 6th century Britain. The real Arthur, if he existed, would be baffled by all of this. Camelot, Round Table, Grail quests, Guinevere's affair with his best knight. None of that was in his world, if he had a world. And yet, here's what's beautiful. The legend works. It endures, because it speaks to something timeless, the desire for just leadership, the dream of a golden age, the tragedy of betrayal, the hope that heroes never truly die but wait to return when needed most. Medieval writers took whatever fragments of history existed about Arthur and built something magnificent, something false probably in terms of historical fact, but true in terms of meaning, true in terms of what stories can do, inspire, comfort, challenge, transform. And that's the real magic of the Arthur legend. Not Merlin's spells or Excalibur's power, but the alchemy of storytelling, the ability to take a name, maybe a memory, possibly a man, and turn it into something immortal. But now we stand at an interesting crossroads, because for centuries Arthur existed in this realm of legend and literature. Historians either accepted the medieval accounts uncritically or dismissed the whole thing as fiction. There was no middle ground, no way to investigate. And then came modern science, archaeology, DNA analysis, carbon dating, isotope studies, forensic analysis, all the tools of 21st century scientific investigation, and suddenly we can ask questions about the Dark Ages that previous generations couldn't even imagine. We can't prove Arthur existed, but we can prove what life was like in 6th century Britain. We can prove how people moved, what they ate, where they came from, how they died. We can prove things about the Saxon migration that contradict both the medieval legends and the earlier historical assumptions. And what modern science is revealing about Britain's Dark Ages is absolutely fascinating. In some ways, it confirms things we suspected. In other ways, it completely overturns what we thought we knew. So let's leave the legends for a moment. Let's put Arthur on trial. Let's see what happens when you apply rigorous scientific method to the mysteries of the Dark Ages. Let's see what genetics, archaeology, climate science, and forensic analysis can tell us about this period. Because the truth, as it turns out, is stranger and more interesting than either the medieval romances or the old historical narratives suggested. The truth is messy, complex, and still unfolding. But it's real, and reality, when you dig deep enough, has its own kind of magic. There's a skeleton lying on an examination table in a laboratory somewhere in England, maybe at Oxford, maybe Cambridge, maybe one of the smaller regional universities that specialise in forensic archaeology. The skeleton was excavated from a cemetery dating to the early 6th century, and it's about to tell us its secrets. First, the archaeologist takes a small sample of tooth enamel. Teeth are amazing because they form in childhood and don't remodel like bone. Whatever isotopes, chemical signatures, were in your drinking water when you were 7 years old are locked in your teeth forever. The lab analyzes the isotopes. Specifically, they're looking at oxygen-18 and strontium-87. Different regions have different isotope ratios depending on the geology and climate. It's like a chemical fingerprint of where you grew up. The results come back. This person's tooth enamel doesn't match British isotope signatures. Instead, it matches northern Germany, specifically the region around modern-day Schleswig-Holstein. So we know this person was born in Germany. They migrated to Britain, probably as a child or young adult, and they died and were buried in Britain. But wait, there's more. The archaeologist takes a bone sample from the same skeleton. Bone remodels constantly throughout life. The isotopes in your bones reflect what you've been eating and drinking for the past few years before death. These bone isotopes do match British signatures. This person lived in Britain long enough for their bones to reflect British food and water. They'd been there years, probably decades, so we've got an immigrant. Someone born in Germany who came to Britain young and stayed. One of the Saxon settlers we've been talking about. Real. Tangible. Not a legend or a theory, but an actual human being whose life we can trace through chemistry. Now, the DNA. The geneticist extracts ancient DNA from the same skeleton. Incredibly difficult, incredibly expensive, but possible with modern techniques. And the DNA reveals ancestry. This person's genetic markers match populations from northern continental Europe, Germanic ancestry confirming what the isotopes suggested. But here's where it gets interesting. The cemetery where this skeleton was found contains dozens of burials. The team analyzes more of them, and they find a mix. Some show the same pattern, born in Germany, lived in Britain. Some show British isotopes in their teeth, meaning they were born in Britain, but they're buried in a Saxon-style cemetery with Saxon grave goods. And some show mixed ancestry in their DNA, Germanic and British, intermarriage, cultural blending. Not everywhere, not completely, but it happened. This is what modern science can do. It can take the dry historical questions. Were the Saxon invasions violent or peaceful? Did the Britons get killed or assimilated? How much population replacement actually occurred? And give us actual data. Dr. Duncan Sayer at the University of Central Lancashire has been leading some of this research, and his findings are fascinating. He studied burial sites across eastern England and found that Saxon migration was real. Significant numbers of people did come from the continent, but it was varied. Some areas saw massive population replacement, others saw cultural adoption by local populations. Most saw something in between. It's not the simple story of invasion and genocide that the medieval chronicles suggested. It's not the simple story of peaceful migration that some revisionist historians proposed. It's complicated, messy, human. But isotope analysis and DNA are just the beginning. Let's talk about what else modern science is revealing. Climate data. Did you know that the mid-6th century, right around 535 to 536 AD, experienced one of the worst climate catastrophes in recorded history? Tree ring data from across the northern hemisphere shows something extraordinary. Growth rings become incredibly thin in 536 AD and stay thin for several years. That means trees weren't growing normally. They weren't getting enough sunlight. Ice core samples from Greenland show elevated sulfate deposits from 535-536, suggesting a massive volcanic eruption. But we don't know where. No records survive of which volcano it was. What we do know is the effects. Byzantine historian Procopius, writing about events he witnessed personally, describes 536 AD like this. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. Chinese chronicles describe the same thing: dimmed sun, failed harvest, snow in summer. Irish annals record a failure of bread in 536-539. This wasn't local, it was global. Something, probably a volcanic eruption, possibly multiple eruptions, or maybe a meteor impact, threw enough debris into the atmosphere to dim the sun for months or even years. Temperatures dropped, crops failed, famine spread. And where was Britain in all this? Right in the middle of the Dark Ages, right after the Battle of Badon, if we date it to around 500 AD, during the supposed Arthurian peace. The climate catastrophe would have hit both Britons and Saxons: failed harvests, starvation, social collapse. It might explain why the Anglo-Saxon expansion paused for those 50 years. Not because they were militarily defeated, though that might have contributed, but because everyone was struggling to survive. The Annales Cambriae record Arthur's death at Camlan in 537 AD, right in the middle of the climate crisis. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the famines and hardships of those years led to increased conflict, civil wars, desperate battles over dwindling resources. We can't prove it. But the timing is suggestive, and it shows how climate can shape history in ways that no chronicle records, because people living through it don't realize the cause. Let's talk about battlefield archaeology. For centuries, historians couldn't find physical evidence of Dark Ages battles. No battlefields, no mass graves, no weapons caches. It was like the battles described in the chronicles never happened. But modern techniques are changing that. Metal detecting, geophysical surveys, careful landscape analysis. These tools are finding battle sites that were invisible before. They haven't found Badon. Not yet, maybe not ever, but they've found other 5th and 6th century conflict sites. And what's interesting is that many show relatively small engagements. Not massive army versus army battles, but skirmishes, raids, ambushes. Which makes sense, right? After Rome fell, Britain didn't have the organisation for massive pitched battles. What they had were war bands, maybe a few hundred warriors, led by local kings or warlords. The Battle of Badon might have involved a few thousand fighters total, not tens of thousands. Scale matters when we're trying to understand this period. We can't think in terms of Roman legions or medieval armies. We have to think smaller, more personal, more local. Metallurgical analysis is revealing things about weapons and armour too. By studying the composition and construction of swords from this period, researchers can tell where the metal came from, how it was worked, what techniques the smiths used. Some Saxon swords show incredibly sophisticated pattern welding techniques, folding and forging different grades of steel to create blades that were both flexible and hard. This wasn't crude barbarian metalwork. This was expert craftsmanship requiring generations of accumulated knowledge. British metalwork from the period is harder to find. They buried without grave goods, remember. But what survives shows continuity with late Roman techniques. Different traditions, both sophisticated. And here's something that surprised researchers. Analysis of battleground sites shows that most combat-related injuries were to the head and shoulders. Skulls cracked by swords or axes, defensive wounds on forearms. This tells us about fighting styles, about whether people wore helmets, many didn't, about the brutal reality of Dark Ages warfare. This wasn't chivalric combat. This was close-quarters violence with sharp metal. It was ugly and terrifying and brief. Most battles probably lasted minutes, not hours. Most warriors probably never fought more than a few battles in their entire lives. But DNA studies are revealing something else fascinating. Disease. Ancient DNA can identify pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and researchers have found evidence of plague, specifically Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, in 6th century European remains. The Justinian plague, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, swept through the Mediterranean and Europe in 541–549 AD. It killed millions, possibly 1/3 of the population in affected areas, and it reached Britain. Think about that. The Britons and Saxons, already struggling with climate catastrophe, with failed harvests, with warfare, then get hit by plague. By the mid-6th century, Britain's population might have been half what it was in 500 AD, maybe less. No wonder written records disappeared. No wonder towns emptied. No wonder kingdoms collapsed. They were fighting for survival against enemies they couldn't see and didn't understand. This is the context, the real historical context, for the end of Arthur's story. If Arthur died at Camlan in 537, he missed the worst of it. But his successors, whoever they were, faced climate catastrophe and plague on top of everything else. The 50 years of peace after Badon weren't peaceful. They were a desperate struggle for survival against famine, disease, and each other, and the Saxons eventually won not through superior military might, but because they survived. They had population reinforcements from the continent. They had less attachment to Roman systems that were failing. They adapted better. Modern environmental archaeology is revealing things about daily life too. By analysing soil samples, plant remains, animal bones, archaeologists can reconstruct what people ate, how they farmed, what their environment looked like. And it's not the picture of barbarism that Dark Ages suggests. People were farming efficiently, raising livestock, hunting and fishing. They were living off the land successfully, even without Roman technology and infrastructure. Archaeological surveys of rural settlements show continuous occupation through the 5th and 6th centuries. People didn't disappear, they just stopped building in stone, stopped writing things down, stopped being visible to history. And when you excavate their settlements carefully, you find evidence of craft production, trade, social organisation, not chaos, but adaptation, not collapse, but transformation. So what does all this science tell us about Arthur? Well, directly, nothing. We can't DNA test Arthur because we don't have his body, if he ever had a body. We can't carbon date the Battle of Badon because we don't know where it was or if any material remains survive. But indirectly, science tells us a lot. It tells us that the world Arthur supposedly lived in, 6th century Britain, was more complex than either the romantic legends or the old Dark Age chaos narratives suggested. It was a world where people migrated but also mixed, where cultures clashed but also blended, where climate and disease shaped history as much as kings and battles, where the victors weren't always the strongest but the most adaptable. It was a world where someone like Arthur, a skilled war leader, a unifying figure, someone who could organize resistance and win crucial victories, could have existed and made a real difference, at least temporarily. Science can't prove Arthur was real, but it can prove that the story of Dark Ages Britain is real, is fascinating, is worth understanding, and it can show us that legends often contain kernels of truth, even if those truths are different from what the legends claim. The scientific investigation of Dark Ages Britain is ongoing. Every year brings new discoveries, new techniques, new insights. Maybe someday someone will find a battlefield that matches the description of Badon. Maybe someone will find an inscription that mentions Arthur by name. Maybe someone will uncover evidence that definitively proves or disproves his existence. But until then, we're left with what we have: fragments, possibilities, and the enduring power of a legend that refuses to die. Because here's the ultimate truth that science can't quite capture. It doesn't matter, not really, whether Arthur was real. What matters is that people believed in him. What matters is that his story gave them hope, inspired them to resist, shaped their identity for centuries. The Britons who became the Welsh, the Cornish, the Bretons, they kept Arthur alive. They told his story to their children, who told it to their children. Through all the centuries of defeat, occupation, marginalization, they held on to Arthur. The promise that he would return, the memory that once, just once, they almost won. And that story, that legend, that promise, that's real, that's measurable, that's significant. Not in terms of what happened in 537 AD or whenever, but in terms of what it meant to every generation since. So maybe the question isn't, was Arthur real? Maybe the question is, why do we still care? And that's what we need to explore in these final moments together. Not the historical Arthur or the legendary Arthur, but the eternal Arthur. The Arthur who lives in our collective imagination. The Arthur who returns generation after generation in new forms for new times. Because Arthur never really left. He's been here all along, wearing different faces, speaking to different needs, but always representing the same essential things: resistance, justice, sacrifice, hope. So let's finish this journey where it began, with the question of why legends matter, why Arthur matters, why 1500 years after whatever did or didn't happen in the mists of Dark Ages Britain, we're still telling this story, still searching for this king, still waiting for his return. Here's something that will give you chills. In every major crisis Britain has faced over the past 1,000 years, someone has invoked Arthur. Someone has whispered his name. Someone has suggested that maybe, just maybe, the time has come for his return. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, stories spread among the Welsh that Arthur would rise from Avalon to drive out the invaders. It didn't happen, but the hope sustained them. When Henry VII, a Welsh Tudor, claimed the English throne in 1485, he named his firstborn son Arthur. The message was clear. The ancient line of British kings has returned. Arthur was reclaiming his throne. Young Arthur died before becoming king, but the symbolism had already done its work. When Britain faced Napoleon, poets and propagandists reached for Arthurian imagery. When World War II threatened to destroy everything, Winston Churchill, consciously or not, styled himself as an Arthur figure. The lone voice calling for resistance, the leader who refused to surrender, the bulldog who would fight them on the beaches, and even today in movies, TV shows, books, video games, Arthur keeps coming back. Different versions, different interpretations, but always Arthur. Always the king. Always the promise of return. Why? Why does this legend refuse to die? I think it's because Arthur represents something we desperately need to believe, that heroes are real, that courage matters, that one person or one moment can change everything. Think about the core of the Arthur story, stripped of all the medieval embellishments. A leader emerges during the darkest time, when civilization is collapsing, when enemies are winning, when hope seems lost. And this leader says, no, not today. Today, we fight. Today, we hold the line. And they do. They win. They buy time. They prove that resistance is possible, that the darkness can be pushed back, at least for a while. That's a story every culture needs, every generation needs, because every generation faces its own darkness, its own collapsing certainties, its own moment of decision. The genius of the Arthur legend is that it's flexible, it adapts. Each age reimagines Arthur to fit its needs. Medieval writers made him a Christian king because Christianity was central to their worldview. Victorian writers made him a gentleman and a symbol of empire because those were their values. Modern writers make him everything from a post-apocalyptic warlord to a woman to an AI to a refugee. Arthur can be anyone because Arthur represents an idea more than a person. The idea is this: leadership matters, sacrifice matters. Standing up when everything tells you to sit down matters. But here's what's interesting, and this is where the Arthur legend gets really profound. Arthur always fails. Eventually, Camelot always falls. The Round Table always breaks. Arthur always dies or disappears. Even in the most optimistic versions where Arthur goes to Avalon to heal, he leaves. The Golden Age ends. The dream crumbles. Evil wins, at least temporarily. And yet, the story doesn't end in despair. It ends in promise. Arthur will return. When Britain needs him most, when the hour is darkest, he will come back. That's not a historical claim. That's a spiritual one. It's saying, the good we do, the stands we take, the resistance we offer, they're never wasted. They echo. They matter. They come back when needed. You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of what we've learned about Dark Ages Britain, the Romano-British civilization that Arthur supposedly defended. It didn't survive, not in England. The Saxons won. English became the dominant language. Pagan culture replaced Christian, at least for a while. Arthur's resistance failed, historically. But the memory survived. The story survived. The values survived. And centuries later, when England itself became Christian again, when literacy returned, when people wanted to connect with their past, they reached for Arthur. They claimed him. They made him the symbol of everything good about Britain. The Saxons won the war but lost the narrative. The Britons lost the war but won immortality. There's something profound in that, about what actually matters in the long run, about how cultures survive through stories, not just territory, about how meaning outlasts power, and I think that's why we keep returning to Arthur. Because in a world that often feels like it's falling apart, where the barbarians seem to be at the gates, where civilization feels fragile, we need to believe that resistance is possible, that courage counts, that the long defeat, as Tolkien called it, can contain moments of victory. I've spent these past hours with you exploring the historical reality behind the legend, trying to find the man, if there was a man, trying to understand what really happened in 5th and 6th century Britain. And here's what I've learned. The historical truth is messy, fragmentary, impossible to pin down completely. We can't prove Arthur existed. We can't prove he didn't. We can prove that Britain went through an incredibly turbulent period, that cultures clashed, that some people resisted, that someone won the Battle of Badon, whoever they were. But the legendary truth? That's crystal clear. Arthur matters. Arthur endures. Arthur represents something essential about human courage and the refusal to surrender to darkness. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. Because here's what I really think. The search for historical Arthur has always been beside the point. We're not really looking for a 6th century war leader. We're looking for ourselves. For proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. For evidence that standing up to injustice matters even when you lose. For hope that the good we do echoes beyond our lifetime. Arthur, real or imagined, historical or legendary, gives us that. He's permission to resist. He's proof that courage matters. He's the promise that heroes exist and that we can be them. Every time someone chooses to stand up to a bully, they're Arthur. Every time someone speaks truth to power, they're Arthur. Every time someone refuses to surrender their principles, even when it costs them something, they're Arthur. The legend isn't about one king in the 6th century. It's about all of us. It's the story we tell ourselves about who we want to be when everything's on the line, and that's why Arthur keeps returning. Not from Avalon, but from within us. Every generation rediscovers him because every generation needs him, needs the reminder that we're not helpless, that we can fight back, that resistance is possible and meaningful and worth it, even when we lose. I started this journey asking whether King Arthur was real, and I'm ending it realizing I was asking the wrong question. The right question is, what does Arthur mean? And the answer is, Arthur means we don't have to accept defeat. We don't have to surrender to darkness. We don't have to let the barbarians win without a fight. Arthur means that somewhere, in the mists of time, people stood up. They resisted. They fought. They bought precious time for their civilization, for their values, for their people. And even though they ultimately lost, even though the Saxons conquered Britain, even though Rome fell, even though the Golden Age ended, their courage mattered. Their resistance mattered. Their story survived. And because their story survived, we have it. We can be inspired by it. We can draw strength from it. We can say, they stood, so will I. That's the real magic of Arthur. Not Merlin's spells or Excalibur's power, but the alchemy of storytelling that transforms historical defeat into eternal inspiration. 1,500 years ago, give or take, something happened in Britain. Maybe there was a man named Arthur. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe there was a battle called Badon. Maybe there wasn't. The mists of time hide the details. But we know this. People resisted. People fought. People refused to let their world end without a struggle. And their courage, their defiance, their refusal to surrender, that created a story so powerful it survived everything. Survived the fall of kingdoms, survived the death of languages, survived the replacement of entire civilizations. Arthur survived because we need him to survive. Because as long as there are people facing darkness and wondering if resistance is possible, Arthur's answer will echo through time. Yes, stand. Fight. Your courage matters. You matter. And maybe, in the end, that's what the promise of Arthur's return really means. Not that a literal king will rise from Avalon, but that in every generation, in every moment of crisis, someone will stand up. Someone will resist. Someone will be Arthur. Maybe it's you. So we've reached the end of our journey through Britain's dark ages. We've walked through collapsing empires and desperate battles. We've examined archaeological evidence and medieval legends. We've tried to separate history from myth and discovered they're more intertwined than we thought. We've met Ambrosius, the forgotten hero. We've stood on the cliffs of Tintagel and marvelled at its impossible grandeur. We've searched for Badon and found that some mysteries may never be solved. We've watched Arthur transform from whatever he might have been into what he became, the greatest legend Britain ever produced. And I hope, somewhere along this journey, you felt what I feel. Wonder. Wonder at how stories survive. Wonder at human courage in impossible circumstances. Wonder at the way legend and history dance together, each illuminating the other. The world of King Arthur, the lost world of Britain's dark ages, is a world of shadows and fragments. But within those shadows we can still glimpse something extraordinary. The last gasp of Roman civilization in the West. The birth of English identity. The courage of people caught between worlds, fighting for survival against impossible odds. That world gave us Arthur, and Arthur in turn gives us something back. Hope. Inspiration, the permission to resist, the reminder that courage matters, even in the long defeat. So thank you. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Thank you for staying curious, for asking questions, for caring about history and legend and meaning, Thank you for spending these hours in the mist and mystery of the Dark Ages, searching with me for a king who might never have existed but who will never die. If you've enjoyed this story, I hope you'll join me again, because history is full of mysteries, full of legends, full of moments where humanity faced darkness and chose to light a candle. And each of those moments, each of those stories is worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into our own dark times. Until we meet again, remember Arthur's lesson. Stand when you can, fight when you must, and know that your courage, your resistance, your refusal to surrender to darkness, it matters, it echoes, it endures. The once and future king isn't coming back from Avalon. He's already here. He's been here all along. In every act of courage, every gesture of defiance, every person who stands up and says, "Not today. Today we fight. Be Arthur. We need you to be. Good night, friends. Sleep well." And may your dreams be filled with knights and castles, with courage and hope, with the eternal promise that the good we do never truly dies. It just waits, sleeping in Avalon, ready to return when we need it most. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.